Victor Caldwell didn't bother knocking. He pushed open the door to Graham Holloway's ranch office like he already owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He dropped a folded document onto the desk without a word, then leaned back against the doorframe and smiled the way a man smiles when he knows the other person has nowhere left to go. 10 days? Victor said. That's what the bank gave you. You know what I gave you? He tapped the document with one finger. An easy way out. Sign that over now, and I'll let you keep the bunkhouse through winter, out of generosity. Graham didn't touch the paper. Victor's smile didn't waver. He picked up the framed photograph from the desk, Graham's father standing in front of the ranch the year it was built, and turned it over in his hands like it was something he'd found in the dirt. Your father was stubborn too, Victor said. Didn't do him much good, did it? He set the photograph face down on the desk and walked out. That was the moment Graham Holloway decided he would rather burn the ranch to the ground than let Victor Caldwell have it. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens next. There are more stories coming that will keep you up at night. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get back to Graham and the woman nobody saw coming. The advertisement had been Graham's idea, and he'd felt embarrassed about it from the moment he mailed it. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. He'd grown up watching his father solve every problem with his own two hands, and he'd spent 30 years trying to do the same. But the drought had taken 3 summers in a row, and the cattle numbers were down to a fraction of what they'd once been, and the windmill had cracked at the base and collapsed in October, and the bank, First Territorial Bank of Helena, had sent a very polite letter in November explaining that the mortgage was in default and that unless full payment was received, foreclosure proceedings would begin after the new year, 10 days after Christmas. That was the timeline. Graham had read that letter 4 times, sitting alone at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, and each time he finished reading it, he folded it back up and set it face down on the table, as if not looking at it would change what it said. He had no children. His wife, Clara, had died 6 years ago from a fever that moved too fast for the doctor to catch. The ranch hands had drifted off one by one when the paychecks started coming late and then stopped coming at all. His nearest neighbor, old Pete Garvey, had sold his property to Victor Caldwell 18 months ago and moved to live with his daughter in Billings. So Graham sat alone with a dead windmill and a dying herd and a letter from a bank. And somewhere in that silence, he'd gotten the idea to place a matrimonial advertisement in the Frontier Companion, a paper that ran such things for men and women in isolated territories who had no other reasonable way to find companionship. He'd written it carefully, spending 2 evenings on a single paragraph. He described himself as a rancher in his early 60s, in good health, of honest character, seeking a woman of similar age and disposition to share his home and his life. He mentioned the Montana frontier. He mentioned the cattle operation. He did not mention the bank letter. He did not mention the windmill lying in pieces beside the water trough. He did not mention that the cattle operation consisted of 43 head when it had once been 212. He told himself it wasn't lying. He told himself he was just leading with the good parts. 3 weeks after the advertisement ran, he received a reply. Her name was Margaret Ellison. She was 58 years old, a widow from eastern Kansas, and her letter was unlike any of the other 2 responses he'd received. The other women had written cautiously, asking about the size of the house and the distance from town and whether he had a piano. Margaret Ellison wrote about work. She said she had spent most of her adult life running a family equipment repair shop alongside her husband, Thomas, who had died 4 years earlier. She said she was not afraid of hard labor and did not expect an easy life. She said she was looking for a place where her skills could be of use, not a place where she would be expected to sit by a window and grow old gracefully. Graham had read that letter twice and thought, she sounds like exactly the kind of woman I need. He had replied by return mail, and they had exchanged 4 more letters over the following weeks. He had been honest about the distance from Helena, about the cold winters, about the fact that the ranch was going through a difficult season. I used the phrase difficult season deliberately because it was technically accurate and also because it sounded temporary. He did not use the phrase bank foreclosure in 10 days. When she wrote back to say she would arrive on the 23rd of December, the last train before Christmas, Graham had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite hope. Something smaller than hope and more fragile, like a coal still glowing after the fire has gone mostly out. He'd driven the wagon to the Millhaven train station in the dark, leaving before 4 in the morning to make the journey in time. The station itself was barely a station, a platform, a small covered waiting area, and an agent's office that was only staffed twice a week. But the train still stopped there, and that was enough. He stood on the platform in the cold with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned to the throat and watched the eastern horizon for the first sign of the locomotive's smoke. The train was 40 minutes late. He didn't mind. He'd waited longer for worse things. When it finally rolled in, grinding and hissing to a stop, Graham straightened up and fixed his expression into something he hoped looked welcoming without being desperate. Several passengers stepped off. A young couple with luggage, 2 men in suits who looked like they'd been sent by a bank or a law office, a family with 3 small children who looked exhausted. And then Margaret Ellison stepped onto the platform. Graham had expected. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected. Someone who looked like she needed something. Someone a little uncertain, maybe, or a little soft around the edges from a life spent mostly indoors. The letters had sounded capable, but letters could be written by anyone, and people tended to describe themselves generously when they were trying to make an impression. What he saw was a woman who moved like she'd been doing hard things her whole life, and had stopped being surprised by them. She was not tall, but she stood like someone taller. Her coat was plain and dark and had clearly been mended at the left cuff. She carried a single leather suitcase in her right hand, not dragging it, carrying it, and her eyes moved across the platform with the methodical attention of someone conducting an inventory. She found him before he found her. "Mr. Holloway," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." He reached for the suitcase. I have it." She shifted the suitcase slightly, not aggressively, just as a natural statement of fact. "It's not heavy." There was a beat of silence. "The wagon's this way," Graham said. "All right." They walked to the wagon in the dark without much conversation, which Graham found either comfortable or terrible and couldn't quite decide which. He helped her up to the seat and climbed up beside her and turned the horses toward home, and the silence stretched out across the frozen ground ahead of them, like something that would need to be dealt with eventually. Margaret spoke first. "How far?" "About 2 hours. Maybe a little more in the cold." She nodded and pulled her coat tighter and looked out at the dark plains rolling past. For a long time she didn't say anything else, and Graham was starting to think the whole drive might go that way, when she spoke again. "That fence line back there, the one along the north pasture. How long has it been down?" Graham tightened his hands on the reins. "You could see that in the dark?" "Moon's almost full," she said simply. "Posts are rotted at the base. You can tell from the angle they're leaning. How long?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since September, more or less." "Cattle?" "Mostly staying put. It's too cold to wander far." She seemed to file this information away somewhere. "What else needs repair?" Something in Graham's chest tightened. He hadn't been ready for the conversation to go this direction this quickly. He thought there would be more of a settling-in period. Some coffee, maybe. Some polite conversation about the journey. "There's a list," he admitted. "How long a list?" He exhaled slowly. The horses plodded on. "It's a long list." She didn't respond to that immediately. When she did speak, her voice was even. "I figured. The letters I sent were honest about some things and careful about others," she said. "I'm not a young woman, Mr. Holloway. I know what difficult season means when a rancher writes it." Graham stared at the road ahead. "I should have been more direct." "Yes," she said. "You should have been." Another silence. This one felt different. Not comfortable exactly, but at least honest. "The bank is taking the ranch," he said, "after Christmas. 10 days, give or take." He heard her exhale, slow and controlled. "How much?" "More than I have." "How much more?" He told her the number. It was a large number. It had kept him awake for months. Margaret didn't flinch, as far as he could tell in the dark. She sat very still with her suitcase braced against her knee and looked at the road. "Is that everything?" she asked. "There's a broken windmill. The water situation is bad. Cattle numbers are down to about 40 head. I had hands, but they left when the wages stopped." "When did the wages stop?" "August." She nodded slowly, like she was doing arithmetic in her head, like she was trying to figure out whether the numbers added up to something survivable. "I wrote you about my work," she said. Did you read it carefully? I did. I ran a repair shop for 22 years. Equipment, machinery, ironwork. Not dabbling, full-time work. I know forges. I know metalwork. I know how to fix things people say can't be fixed. I know, Graham said. That's part of why I'm not here to be somebody's last resort, Margaret said, and her voice was still even, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been kept under careful pressure for a long time. I made a decision to come out here because I wanted to build something again, not because I had nowhere else to go. I need you to understand the difference before we go any further. Graham was quiet for a long moment. I understand the difference, he said finally, and I'm not treating you like a last resort. I'm treating you like… He paused, trying to get it right. Like someone who might know things I don't. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Not comfortable yet, but possibly the beginning of comfortable. All right, Margaret said. Tell me about the forge. Graham blinked. The forge? You have one. I can tell by the way you said the windmill cracked. You mentioned it had an iron brace. That kind of repair doesn't happen without a forge somewhere on the property. Is it still functional? He hadn't thought about the forge in years. His father had built it, and it had been used occasionally. But Graham had no skill with ironwork, and after his father died, it had just stood there, rusting quietly behind the main barn. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe. It hasn't been used in a long time. But it's there. It's there. Margaret said nothing else for the rest of the drive, but Graham noticed that she was looking at the land differently now. Not with disappointment, as he'd feared, but with the focused attention of someone who was looking for something specific. He didn't know yet what she was looking for. He found out just before dawn. They arrived at the ranch as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Graham helped Margaret down from the wagon and showed her inside, showed her where she'd sleep, pointed out the kitchen and the stove and the thin stack of firewood he'd prepared. He'd cleaned the house as well as he knew how to clean it, which was not particularly well, and he could tell from the brief sweep of her gaze that she noticed both the effort and its limitations. I'll make coffee, he said. In a minute. She set her suitcase down beside the narrow bed and unclasped the latches and opened it. Show me the forge first. It's before sunup. I know what time it is. She pulled out a heavy canvas roll from the suitcase. Tools, Graham realized, wrapped and secured with leather ties, and set it aside. Show me the forge. He showed her the forge. It was behind the main barn, tucked under a lean-to that kept the worst of the weather off it. The bellows had rotted and the tuyere was rusted, and there was a bird's nest wedged into the firebox that had been there for at least 2 seasons. The anvil was still sound, solid iron, well-shaped. Graham's father had been proud of it, and the hammers and tongs were still hanging on the wall, coated in rust but intact. Margaret walked around the forge slowly, touching the anvil, testing the hammer handles, pulling the bird's nest out of the firebox with her bare hand and dropping it on the ground. This is fixable, she said. The bellows alone are replaceable. I can rebuild them. She was already crouching to examine the base of the forge, running her fingers along the fire brick. The fire brick is in better shape than I expected. How much coal or charcoal do you have on the property? Some charcoal. Not a lot. It'll do for now. She stood up, dusting her hands on her coat. I need a few supplies from town. Not many. The town is 12 miles. I know. We passed through it. She looked at him steadily. I'll need to go in the next day or two, before Christmas. Graham looked at the forge, then at this woman he'd met less than 2 hours ago, standing in the pale pre-dawn dark with a canvas roll of tools under her arm, speaking about replacing bellows and sourcing charcoal as if she'd been planning this for months. Maybe she had been. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking your ranch needs income before it needs anything else, she said, and that there's a Christmas market in Helena in 3 days, and that people in this territory need ironwork, custom pieces, repair work, hardware, and can't always get it because the nearest proper blacksmith is 40 miles away. Graham stared at her. You want to set up a smithing operation in 3 days? I want to set up enough of one to take something to that market, she said. Yes. That's… He searched for the word. That's not a small thing. No, Margaret agreed. It's not. She looked at the forge again, and in the pale light, he caught something in her expression, not excitement exactly, but a kind of focused hunger that he recognized from his own face in younger years when a difficult problem finally showed him its solution. But I've done harder things in less time. He believed her. That was the strange part. He'd known her for less than 2 hours, and he already believed her. I'll get the coffee on, he said. Good. She was already pulling the canvas roll open, laying tools on the workbench beside the forge with the efficient movements of someone who had done this so many times. The sequence had become as natural as breathing. And Mr. Holloway? Graham. She glanced at him sideways. Graham, I'll need you to tell me everything about the ranch. All of it. The full list, not the careful version. The full list is ugly. I've seen ugly before, she said. Tell me anyway. He told her over 2 mugs of coffee at the kitchen table while the sun came up outside. The broken windmill, the water problem, the fence lines, the hay supply, the exact state of the cattle, their condition, their age distribution, the ones he thought might not make it through the winter, the outstanding debts beyond the bank mortgage, the equipment failures, the roof on the secondary barn that needed patching before the heavy snowfall came. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she sat for a moment with her mug in both hands, looking at the surface of the coffee. The windmill is the most urgent after the bank, she said. No working windmill in winter means hauling water by hand, which means you're burning time and strength you don't have. I know. I can fix the windmill. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. Not as a boast, just as a statement of what was true. Not today, but within the week, if the parts are manageable. The main shaft cracked. Show me when there's light. Margaret, he stopped, started again. Why are you doing this? She looked up from her coffee. Her eyes were a kind of dark gray that looked lighter in certain light, and they had the quality that some people's eyes have after enough years of paying close attention to things, patient and measuring and very difficult to fool. Because I came here to work, she said, and because you asked me honestly once I pushed you to it, which is more than most people manage. A pause. And because that forge hasn't been used in years, and it's a waste, and I don't like waste. It was not a romantic answer. It was not the answer a person gives when they're trying to make someone feel good. It was honest, and Graham had been living without honest for long enough that he felt it like cold water on his face. All right, he said. When do you want to see the windmill? Now, she said, and pushed back her chair. The windmill was worse than he'd remembered, which was saying something because he'd remembered it as bad. The main shaft had cracked through at a stress point about 8 feet up, and when it went down, it had taken 2 of the upper vane brackets with it. The whole assembly lay in a heap beside the trough, dusted with snow, rusting at the edges. Margaret walked around it twice without speaking. She crouched and examined the crack in the shaft, ran her fingers along it, tapped it in 2 places with her knuckles. What? Graham asked, watching her. This crack didn't happen all at once, she said. See this? She pointed to a section near the edge. This is where it started. Probably months ago. It was working its way through before it finally let go. Did you notice anything? Vibration maybe, or a sound when it was running? He thought back. There was a rattle, last summer. I thought it was the vanes. It was the shaft. If you'd caught it then, this would have been a repair, not a replacement. She stood up, brushing snow off her knees. It still is a repair, if I can get the right stock iron. You can work with a cracked shaft? I can splice it with a collar if the crack is clean. It's not pretty, but it holds. She looked up at the top of the tower. The vane brackets are the harder problem. Do you still have the broken ones? Somewhere in the barn. I need to see them before I can tell you what we're looking at. They spent the next hour in the barn going through the debris pile where Graham had stacked the fallen equipment, not organized, just piled, which earned him a look from Margaret that he felt without her needing to say anything about it. She found the brackets, examined them, set 2 aside as salvageable, and put the 3rd down with the flat certainty of someone making a diagnosis. This one's gone, she said, but I can fabricate a replacement if I have the right stock. On the forge. On the forge. She dusted her hands again, a habit he was already starting to recognize, that dusting off gesture that came at the end of each assessment, like closing a chapter. I need to get that forge operational today. It's Christmas Eve tomorrow. I know what day it is. She looked at him without impatience, but also without softness. Do you want to save this ranch or don't you? Yes, he said. Then let's stop noting the obstacles and start moving them. He'd been told off more gently than that by people who'd meant it more harshly, and he couldn't entirely explain why this landed the way it did, not as criticism, but as something closer to permission. permission to stop treating the problems as reasons and start treating them as problems. He picked up the heavier of the two salvageable brackets and followed her back to the forge. The rest of that day was unlike any Graham had spent in years. Margaret rebuilt the bellows from canvas and hardwood scraps she found in the barn, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had done it before and knew exactly which steps to skip and which couldn't be skipped. She cleaned the fire brick, cleared the tuyere, built a small test fire with the charcoal to check the draw. The first fire in the forge in 4 years flared up, orange and breathing, and Graham stood back and watched it and felt something he couldn't name. Margaret didn't pause to appreciate it. She was already feeding the first piece of iron into the heat. She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping once for water and once to eat some of the bread and dried beef Graham put together from what he had in the kitchen. She didn't stop because she was tired. She stopped because the charcoal supply ran low, and she didn't want to push the fire past what the fuel could sustain. "Tomorrow," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth, "I need to go into town. Coal, some stock iron, a few other things." "The market runs in Millhaven on Christmas Eve morning," Graham said. "We could go early." "We'll go before it gets busy." She looked at what she'd completed. 2 small repairs on tools she'd found lying broken in the barn, and a test piece, a simple hook that she'd made just to confirm the forge was drawing properly. She picked up the hook and turned it in her hands, checking the curve, checking the weld. "This'll do," she said. It was, Graham thought, the most satisfied he'd seen her look all day. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, a simple meal, nothing worth describing, and Graham watched Margaret across the table and tried to reconcile the woman in front of him with every assumption he'd carried to that train platform. He'd thought he needed someone to make the house feel less empty. He hadn't known he needed someone who would make the forge burn again. "The Christmas market in Helena," he said. "You mentioned it this morning. Do you really think—" "I think we have 2 days," Margaret said, "and I think people in this territory have been making do with broken equipment because there's no one nearby who can do decent ironwork." She took a slow drink of water. "I've been doing this my whole working life. I know what sells, and I know how to make it fast without making it cheap." "What were you thinking? What kind of pieces?" "Hardware first. Hinges, latches, brackets. Things that wear out and need replacing. Then decorative pieces, because people at Christmas markets buy decorative pieces." She set her glass down. "And anything that can be customized. Initials, shapes, patterns. People pay more for something that looks like it was made for them." "In 2 days." "In 2 days." Graham looked at the table, at the coffee rings and the old scratches in the wood from years of tools being set down carelessly, at the letter from the bank that was still folded on the far corner, face down. "I haven't told you something," he said. Margaret waited. "Victor Caldwell. He came by before I left to meet the train. He brought a purchase offer. Wants me to sign the ranch over now before the foreclosure. Says he'll let me keep the bunkhouse." Margaret's expression didn't change much, a slight tightening around the eyes. "Is he the one who's been buying up land in this territory?" "About 4 ranches in the last 2 years. Every one of them was in some kind of trouble before he stepped in." Graham picked up his fork, put it back down. "He's not buying because he wants to ranch. He's buying to consolidate. There's talk that he's planning to fence the whole eastern watershed and charge water access fees, which would put every small rancher in the area in his debt. Or out of business entirely." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Did you sign?" "No." "Are you going to?" The question was simple and direct and without any particular pressure behind it, and somehow that made it easier to answer. "No," Graham said. "I'm not." "All right." She stood up and began clearing the dishes with the unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. "Then we have 2 days. I suggest we both get some sleep." Graham sat at the table for a few minutes after she'd gone to her room, listening to the wind outside and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night, and the small sounds of the ranch breathing around him. 2 days. He'd been told the ranch was dying for the better part of a year, and in that whole time he hadn't been able to figure out a way to argue with that verdict. Now, for the first time in months, he wasn't sure the verdict was final. He folded the bank letter and put it in his coat pocket and went to check on the cattle. The next morning came in cold and clear, and Margaret was already at the forge before Graham had finished with the horses. He found her feeding the fire and sorting through a collection of iron scraps she'd pulled from various corners of the barn, pieces he'd never thought to look at twice, lengths of rod and flat bar, and broken hardware that she was examining and setting into groups with the deliberate attention of someone who could see what they would become. "You eat?" he asked. "Not yet." He brought her bread and coffee to the forge, and she took both without stopping her sorting, eating with one hand while she turned a piece of rod over in the other. "This is good stock," she said, holding up a length of square bar. "Where'd this come from?" "My father ordered it years ago, had plans for a gate he never built." "What were the plans?" Graham almost said he didn't know, but then he remembered. A sketch, penciled on brown paper, tucked in the back of his father's account book. He'd seen it years ago and never known what to do with it. "I might have a drawing," he said. Margaret looked up. "Get it." He found it in the account book, where it had been sitting for probably 15 years. A careful pencil sketch of a ranch gate with ironwork scrolls along the top bar and the ranch brand worked into the center. His father's handwriting labeled each section, noting the dimensions and the type of bar to use. Margaret studied it for a long time. "Your father had skill," she said finally. "He could draw. He always said he wanted to learn the ironwork itself, but there was never time." She set the drawing on the workbench, weighing down the corners with two of the heaviest tools. "I can build this," she said. "Not today. There isn't time before the market. But this—" She tapped the drawing with one finger. "This is what we do after." Graham looked at the drawing, at his father's careful lines and annotations, at the brand in the center, two overlapping H's, Holloway and Holloway, his father and grandfather's mark. "The gate's for the ranch entrance," he said, "not for selling." "I know." She went back to sorting her stock. "But if I can build that, I can build things like it for other people. Gates, panels, decorative work. It's the kind of craft that doesn't have a lot of competition in this territory because it takes years to learn properly." "How many years did it take you?" She considered. "About 5 before I was good. Another 5 before I was really good." A pause. "Thomas was better than me at the fine work. He had steadier hands." She said it simply, without the particular quiet that sometimes surrounds a thing that still hurts. But Graham noticed she went back to work immediately after, and he didn't ask anything further. They drove to Millhaven in the early morning, reaching it before most of the Christmas Eve traffic had started. Margaret worked through the hardware supplier's inventory with systematic attention, purchasing coal and iron stock in specific quantities, asking questions about sourcing and delivery times that surprised the shop owner into actually looking at her before he answered. On the way back, she sat in the wagon bed with her purchases arranged around her and made a list in a small notebook she produced from her coat pocket, writing in a compressed hand that was difficult to read from where Graham was sitting. "What's on the list?" he asked. "What I can make today and tomorrow morning," she said without looking up. "Working order, fastest to slowest." "What's fastest?" "Small hooks and hangers. People always need those. Then S-hooks, curtain rings, simple latches." She turned a page. "Mid-range, hinge sets, cabinet pulls, coat hooks with mounting plates. Those take longer, but they're what furniture makers and house builders want." "And the Christmas pieces?" She glanced up then. "That's where the money is. Decorative ironwork, ornamental hooks, candle holders, small panel pieces with scrollwork. People at holiday markets spend more on things that look beautiful than things that are just useful." A slight pause. "Even if a beautiful thing is also useful." Graham turned the horses onto the ranch road. The gate stood ahead of them, plain, wooden, nothing distinctive about it. He thought of his father's drawing. "You think we can make enough?" he said. "For the bank payment?" Margaret closed her notebook. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. He appreciated that she didn't dress it up. "But," she added, "I know that if we don't try, we definitely can't make it. So, he agreed. They worked through Christmas Eve, Margaret at the forge, Graham beside her, learning where to stand and when to hand her the next tool and what she needed without her having to stop and ask. He was not skilled, he was very clear about that, and so was she, but he was capable of following instructions and doing the heavy work, and that mattered. By late evening, the bench beside the forge held a collection of ironwork that Graham had never seen the like of, not in quantity, but in quality. The hooks were perfectly shaped. The hinges moved with the smoothness that made you want to open and close them repeatedly. And the decorative pieces, 3 wall panels with scrollwork that Margaret had worked on in the final hours of light, each one slightly different from the others, had a quality that was hard to name but easy to feel. Craftsmanship. That was the word. You could see that a specific person with a specific set of skills had made each piece, had thought about it while making it, had not cut a single corner. "These are good," Graham said, and was aware that it sounded insufficient. Margaret looked at the pieces without false modesty. "Yes," she said, "they are." She covered the work with a tarp and banked the forge fire and went inside, and Graham stood alone in the lean-to for a moment with the smell of coal smoke and iron around him, and looked at what 2 days and one determined woman had produced. Victor Caldwell had stood in this same doorway 6 days ago, with a document in his hand, and that particular smile on his face. Graham pulled the tarp back and looked at the work again. Then he covered it back up and went to get some sleep. He was going to need it for tomorrow. Graham didn't sleep well. He told himself it was the cold. The stove in his room had burned down to nothing by 2 in the morning, and he hadn't wanted to get up to feed it. But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he lay on his back in the dark and did arithmetic he'd already done 100 times, running the numbers on what they'd made and what they needed and what the gap between those two things looked like. And no matter how he arranged the figures, they came out the same way. Not enough. Possibly not even close. He got up before 5 and went to check the cattle. It was something he did when he couldn't sleep, not because the cattle needed checking at that hour, but because the act of moving through the dark with a lantern, hearing the animals shift and breathe, had a settling effect on him that he couldn't quite explain. His father had done the same thing. Maybe it was inherited, like the shape of his hands or his inability to ask for help until the last possible moment. The cattle were fine. 43 head in the main pen, pressing together for warmth, breath rising in small clouds in the lantern light. He stood at the fence and counted them the way he always did, even though the number never changed, and thought about what those 43 animals would be worth if he could get them through the winter and into spring in decent condition. Not enough for the bank. But something. Always something. He was walking back to the house when he saw the light in the forge lean-to. For a moment he thought he'd left a lantern burning by accident, and then he heard the sound, the low breath of the bellows, the particular ring of hammer on iron, and understood that Margaret had already been at it for some time. He pushed open the lean-to door and found her bent over the anvil, working a piece of flat bar into a curve with short, controlled hammer strokes. She was wearing her heavy coat over what looked like work clothes she'd changed into at some point in the night, and her hair was tied back and she didn't look up when he came in. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept 3 hours." She turned the piece in the tongs, examined the curve, went back to the hammer. "That's enough." "For who?" "For me." A pause between strikes. "How are the cattle?" "Fine." He came further in, pulling the door shut against the cold. "What are you working on?" "Curtain rings. I got the hooks and the S-hooks done around 2. She nodded toward the far end of the bench, where a neat row of small pieces was laid out in order. Hooks in 2 sizes, S-hooks, a set of small latches. "Rings are faster than I expected. This iron is good quality." Graham looked at the row of finished pieces. There were more of them than he'd thought there would be. "How many?" 40-something hooks, 16 latches. Rings I'm still working." She set the hammer down, moved the tongs to the edge of the anvil, turned to look at him properly for the first time. Her face had the particular focus of someone who had been working in a sustained way. Not tired exactly, but narrowed down to a point. "I need you to start loading the wagon, carefully. Wrap the decorative pieces in the sacking from the barn. It's 5 in the morning. Helena is 4 hours by road. The market opens at 9. She picked the hammer back up. "We need to leave by 6. Graham looked at her for a moment, at this woman he'd known for 36 hours, who had rebuilt a forge and produced 40-some pieces of ironwork, and was planning to drive 4 hours through December cold to sell them at a Christmas market because it was the only thing standing between his ranch and foreclosure, and felt a complicated thing move through him that he wasn't going to examine too closely right now. "I'll make coffee first," he said. "Make it strong." He made it strong. He brought her a mug at the forge, which she drank in 4 long pulls between working, and he drank his own in the kitchen while he put together food for the road. Bread, dried beef, 2 apples he'd been saving, water in a canteen. Practical things. Things that could be eaten from a moving wagon. By 5:40, he had the wagon loaded. Margaret had a system for it. She'd described it while she was still working, and he'd followed it exactly, because he'd learned in 36 hours that when she described how something should be done, she meant it that way, and there was usually a reason. The heavy hardware went in first, cushioned with straw. The decorative pieces went in the center, wrapped in burlap, nested so they wouldn't shift. The tools went on top in their canvas roll. Margaret came out of the forge at 5:55, wiped her hands, looked at the loaded wagon, and said, "Good." It was the same tone she used for everything, not effusive, not withholding, just accurate. They pulled out of the ranch yard in the dark and headed north toward Helena, and for the first hour neither of them said much. The cold was real, and the road was frozen in places, and Graham kept the horses to a steady pace that wouldn't push them past what they could manage. Margaret sat beside him with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes on the road, and occasionally she made a small sound that wasn't quite a word, but that Graham was starting to learn the grammar of, a kind of quiet processing, like a person running numbers silently. About an hour out, she spoke. "Tell me about Caldwell." Graham shifted on the seat. "What do you want to know?" "How he operates. When he bought the other ranches. What happened exactly?" "Different each time, but the same underneath." Graham watched the road. "First it was the Mackenzie place 3 years ago. Dan Mackenzie had a bad harvest and borrowed against his land to cover it. Victor bought the note from the bank, stepped in before the bank could foreclose and bought it himself. So suddenly Dan didn't owe the bank, he owed Victor, and Victor's terms were worse. When did Dan sign over?" 6 months later. Victor made it easier to sign than to fight." A pause. "The Garvey place I told you about, that was more direct. Pete Garvey was just old and tired, and Victor offered him enough to live on. Pete took it." "And the others?" "One had a water dispute that dragged on for 2 years until the legal fees ate the man alive. Victor helped with the fees out of neighborly concern." Graham said those last 3 words in a particular way that didn't need further explanation. The last one, a young couple, the Harrises. Their barn burned down. Nobody proved anything. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And your situation?" "Bank holds the mortgage. Victor doesn't own the note yet. But if we default and the bank forecloses, I know he's already spoken to the bank president because Carson, that's the president, Warren Carson, Warren can barely look me in the eye anymore." "Carson's in Caldwell's pocket." "I think so. I can't prove it." She made that small sound again. "Processing." If we make this payment," Graham said, "Victor loses his angle. He can't buy the note if it's current, and he can't pressure the bank to call it in without a default to point to." "What does he want the land for?" "The water. The eastern watershed runs through my property, through the back 40, the section my father bought separately 20 years ago. It's the only reliable water source in a 12-mile stretch. Victor fences that off. He controls water for 6 ranches." "Water rights," Margaret said. "Water rights." She was quiet again, longer this time. Outside, the sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of morning along the eastern edge. "He'll come back," she said, "even if we make the payment today." "Yes." "He doesn't seem like a man who stops when things don't go his way." "He's not." Graham exhaled. "He came by the ranch last spring, before things got as bad as they are now. Offered me a good price, fair price actually. Said he admired what my father built and wanted to expand it properly, put real capital behind it." Graham's jaw tightened. "He was very convincing. He knows how to make a thing sound like your idea." "But you didn't sell." "Clara, my wife. She used to say the land was the promise. Not the cattle or the equipment, just the land. That the day we signed it over was the day we said the promise was finished." He was quiet for a beat. "I know that sounds like sentiment." "It doesn't," Margaret said. He glanced at her sideways. She was looking at the road ahead with the same level attention she gave everything. "My husband had a word for it," she said. "Thomas. He'd say something about a thing having—" She paused, looking for the right phrasing. "Having its own weight. That some things can't be measured in dollars because the dollar amount was never actually the point." "That's it exactly," Graham said. He was usually right about things like that. A brief pause. "He was wrong about other things. Kept accounts badly. Terrible judge of which customers would pay and which ones wouldn't." She said it without particular sadness, just the easy accuracy of someone who'd known a person thoroughly enough to see all the way around them. But on that kind of thing, what something is worth past what it sells for, he was right. Graham thought about Clara, and about the way certain kinds of loss don't get smaller with time. They just get further away, so that you stop bumping into them every moment and only find them when you go looking. He didn't say any of that, but he thought Margaret probably understood it without being told. "Helena in about 3 hours," he said. "Good." She pulled her coat tighter. "I want to set up at the end of a main aisle if we can manage it. Corner position if there is one. People turn at corners. They slow down. You've done market selling before. Many times. The shop was in a small town, Granger, in Kansas, and the annual hardware fair was one of our best weeks every year. Thomas handled the people and I handled the display." A very slight pause. "I'll handle both today. I can talk to people. Graham." She said his name with a precision that wasn't unkind but was very clear. "When is the last time you sold something to a stranger?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably 8 years ago, maybe 9. "Then let me do it. You can carry things and answer specific questions if someone asks about the ranch, but let me run the table." He wasn't offended. He'd watched her work for 36 hours and had no rational basis for thinking he'd do it better. "Fine," he said. They reached Helena in the mid-morning, the wagon rolling into the city through streets that were busy with Christmas Eve traffic, families on foot, supply wagons, the occasional horse and rider moving through with more purpose than everyone else. The railway station market was set up on the broad platform in the adjacent freight yard, which had been cleared and marked off into vendor spaces with rope lines and wooden stakes. Margaret studied it all on the way in with the same attention she'd given the windmill, the forge, the cattle. "There," she said, pointing to a spot near the junction of 2 main aisles, where foot traffic from both the platform entrance and the freight yard gate would converge. "Can we get that space?" "We can try." They got it. The market organizer, a stout woman named Mrs. Albright, who wore her authority like a piece of jewelry she'd earned, looked at their wagon and at Margaret and assigned them the space with the efficient briskness of someone who had 40 vendors to place before 9 o'clock and didn't have time to make it complicated. Setting up the display was Margaret's operation. Graham did what he was told. He laid the workbench boards they'd brought across 2 sawhorses, arranged the burlap backdrop she'd specified, and handed her pieces in the order she asked for them while she placed each one with a precision that looked casual but wasn't. The hooks went in ascending size order along the back edge. The latches and hinges were grouped by type. The curtain rings were in a small wooden box she'd produced from somewhere in her suitcase. And the decorative pieces, the scrollwork panels, 3 wall hangings with different patterns, a pair of candle brackets she'd finished in the pre-dawn dark while he was sleeping. These went at the front and center, at eye level, visible from 10 feet away. Graham stood back and looked at it. "That's," he started. "Don't say anything yet," Margaret said, adjusting the angle of one of the candle brackets by approximately ½ an inch. "People are going to start coming through in 10 minutes. I need to think." He was quiet. Around them, other vendors were finishing their own setups: baked goods, preserved foods, bolts of cloth, wooden toys, a man selling leather goods from a cart, the smell of wood smoke and cold air, and something sweet from a food vendor somewhere behind them. At 9 o'clock, the crowd started moving through. For the first 15 minutes, nobody stopped at their table. People walked past, glanced at the hardware, moved on. Graham felt the familiar cold weight of failure beginning to settle in his chest. The specific feeling of a plan that had made sense in theory, now meeting the reality of people who didn't care about it. He kept his face neutral. Margaret stood behind the table with her hands resting on the surface and her eyes tracking the crowd, patient as stone. Then an old man stopped. He was tall and rangy in a worn sheepskin coat, and he stopped because of the candle bracket. Stood there looking at it with his head tilted to the side, the way people do when they're seeing something that doesn't match what they expected to find in a place like this. He picked it up. He turned it over. He examined the curve of the scroll, the way the 2 arms branched from the central mount, the small decorative element at the top where the bracket would attach to a wall. "Who made this?" he asked, and his voice had the particular texture of someone who knew the answer mattered. "I did," Margaret said. He looked at her. The look had a quality to it. Not rude, just honest. The kind of look a man who'd spent 70 years learning what things were worth gave something he wasn't immediately certain how to categorize. "You work in iron," he said. "I do." "For how long?" "About 30 years. He looked at the bracket again, and Graham watched something shift in the old man's expression. Not quite surprised, more like the adjustment a person makes when they've located their assumption and found it wanting. "I had a smith on my place for 12 years, the old man said. "Retired 3 years ago. I've been making do since." He set the bracket down carefully. "What's your name?" "Margaret Ellison." "Frank Dellard. I run the DD Ranch out past Rattlesnake Creek." He looked at the table properly now, for the first time, the way he'd been looking at the bracket. "You make gates?" "I can." "Functional or decorative?" "Both, either. Depends on what's needed." Dellard picked up one of the hinge sets and worked it open and closed once. "These hinges are right," he said. The word right, the way he said it, meant something specific, not just adequate but correct, built with understanding. "Thank you," Margaret said. "I want 2 sets of the hinges and one of those brackets." He reached into his coat. "And I want to talk to you about a gate before you leave today if there's time." "There'll be time," Margaret said. Graham caught Dellard's eye as the old rancher counted out his money, and Dellard gave him a look, brief, appraising, and carrying a message that Graham couldn't fully decipher, but that felt something like, "You know what you have here." After Dellard moved on, others came. It wasn't a flood. It was more like a tide coming in, gradual, then faster, then impossible to ignore. A hardware merchant from the south side of the city stopped and spent 20 minutes examining every piece on the table and left with 6 hook sets and a request for a standing order. 2 women, sisters from the way they talked, bought both of the remaining candle brackets for their mother's Christmas gift, and then stood at the table for another 10 minutes, asking Margaret questions about what else she could make, taking down the ranch address on a slip of paper one of them produced from her handbag. A young carpenter bought every S-hook on the table and asked about custom brackets for a kitchen cabinet project he was working on. A rancher from north of Helena spent a long time talking to Margaret about a specific problem he'd been having with a gate mechanism and left with a latch set and a rough sketch of a solution Margaret had drawn for him on the back of a feed bill he'd had in his pocket. Graham carried, wrapped, made change, held things when people wanted to look at other things. He watched Margaret work the table the way he'd watched her work the forge. Not showing off, not selling hard, just answering questions accurately and letting the work do the talking. When someone expressed doubt, she didn't argue. She simply picked up the piece in question and showed them something specific, a joint, a curve, a surface, and let them arrive at their own conclusion. It was, Graham thought, exactly the kind of selling that worked on people who knew things. And in a frontier hardware market, most of the people who stopped were people who knew things. Around noon, Victor Caldwell arrived. Graham saw him before Margaret did, saw that particular way he moved through a crowd, with the easy entitlement of a man who had never been in a room where he wasn't one of the most important people, and felt a tightening in his shoulders that he recognized as the specific response Victor reliably produced. Victor moved through the market at a browsing pace, stopping at a few tables, exchanging words with people who clearly knew him. He was well dressed for outdoor conditions. Good coat, good boots, the kind of winter clothes that cost enough to keep you warm without making you look like you were trying to keep warm. He reached their table and stopped. He looked at the display. His expression was the one he used for things he didn't consider threatening, politely interested, slightly above it all. Then he looked at Margaret. "You're the woman from the train," he said. Margaret met his gaze without adjustment. "I don't believe we've met." "Victor Caldwell." He said his name as information, not introduction, the way a person says something they expect the other person to already know. "Graham and I have done some business together." "We haven't done any business together," Graham said. Victor's expression didn't shift. "We've discussed it." He looked back at the table. "Quite a display. This your work?" "It is," Margaret said. "I didn't realize you were a craftsman." He picked up one of the remaining hook sets and looked at it with the expression of someone who was performing interest rather than feeling it. "My man in Billings handles my hardware needs, but I'm not looking for your business, Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said. Victor set the hook down. He looked at her with something that was almost surprise but wasn't quite, more like recalibration, the momentary adjustment of a man who'd said something in a room and expected it to land a certain way and found the acoustics different than predicted. "Well," he said pleasantly. "Graham tells me you've been buying land in this territory," Margaret said. Her voice was conversational, easy, with no particular heat in it. 4 ranches in 2 years. It's good land, Victor said. I'm a businessman. When opportunity presents itself, when people are in trouble, you mean? The pleasantness in Victor's expression thinned very slightly at the edges. I help people who can't sustain their operations, turn a difficult situation into a clean exit. That's one way to describe it. Victor looked at Graham. Your friend here has a good understanding of her position. He said it as if it were a compliment, but the architecture of the sentence made it something else. She has a good understanding of most things, Graham said. Victor picked up the sketch of the gate design, his father's sketch, which Graham had brought along meaning to show Margaret, but which had ended up on the edge of the display table. He looked at it with sudden, genuine interest that was harder to perform and easier to see. This is a Holloway gate, Victor said. The brand in the center, the two overlapping H's. Your father's design? His sketch, Graham said. Not built yet. I always admired what your father put into this land. Victor set the sketch down, which is why it's a shame to see it go to ruin for want of capital. He looked at Margaret again, and this time the pleasantness was entirely gone, replaced with something more direct. One good day at a Christmas market won't cover what's owed. We're aware of what's owed, Margaret said. Then you know. We know what we need to make, she said. And I know what I can produce and what it sells for, and how many ranchers and builders in this territory are currently without a reliable smith within 40 miles. She straightened a piece on the table that didn't need straightening, the same deliberate non-reaction she'd used in the forge when something went wrong. I'd say we have a reasonable picture of the situation. Victor looked at her for a long moment. The market noise went on around them, voices, movement, the distant sound of the train platform. And Victor Caldwell stood still in the middle of it with an expression that Graham couldn't entirely read, but that he was fairly sure was Victor Caldwell recalculating something. The bank's deadline doesn't move, Victor said finally. I know what date it is, Margaret said. Victor nodded once, turned, and moved back into the crowd without another word. Graham waited until he was gone. He'll talk to Carson, he said. Probably. Margaret watched the space where Victor had been with the same level attention she gave everything. He wants you to think about him all afternoon and not about the work. I know. So, she turned back to the table. Don't. It was easier said than done, but Graham tried. He focused on the customers, on keeping the display organized as pieces sold and gaps appeared, on listening to the conversations Margaret was having and learning from them which pieces were most wanted and what questions people asked and which answers made them reach for their money. By mid-afternoon, 2/3 of the display was gone. The 3 decorative panels had sold within the first hour. The last one had created a brief competition between 2 buyers that Margaret had resolved with the calm authority of someone who'd refereed more than one dispute in her time, offering to take the second buyer's measurements and fabricate a matching piece. He'd agreed immediately. She'd written it in her notebook. The gate conversation with Frank Dellard happened at 2 o'clock. Margaret had brought the sketch, and she and Dellard spent 20 minutes with it spread on the table while Graham kept an eye on the remaining display and tried to follow the technical discussion, which moved into specifics he didn't entirely track. What he could track was that Dellard knew what he was looking at, and that by the end of the conversation he'd put down a deposit, a real deposit, substantial, for a custom gate to be fabricated at the ranch and delivered by spring. That deposit, combined with the day's sales, was the first time the numbers in Graham's head had rearranged themselves into something that might actually reach the bank. Might. Still might. He was doing the arithmetic again. He couldn't stop doing it. It ran in the background of everything he did like a water wheel that couldn't be turned off. When Margaret appeared beside him, "Stop counting," she said. "I'm not—" "You've got that look." She didn't specify what look. "We have 4 more hours and enough material for 3 more good sales. Focus on that. We might still be short." "We might be." She picked up the remaining candle bracket and repositioned it an inch to the left. "But the transportation contract I've been talking to the man from Northern Supply about for the last hour would cover the difference and then some." Graham turned. "What transportation contract?" "I was going to tell you." She glanced at him sideways. "A Mr. Holt. He handles hardware procurement for 6 wagon teams running supply routes out of Helena. He's been looking for a reliable source for custom axle brackets and wheel hardware because his current supplier in Billings runs late and makes the pieces to a standard size that doesn't account for the weight variation on mountain routes." Graham stared at her. You've been negotiating a supply contract. I've been having a conversation, she said carefully. He's coming back at 4 to continue it, while also running the table. The table wasn't busy at the time. She adjusted the bracket back to where it had been before, apparently having reconsidered. I can do 2 things. The man from Northern Supply, Holt, broad-shouldered and businesslike, and with the kind of permanent road dust quality that came from spending most of your life moving between towns, came back at 4 as promised, and had a conversation with Margaret that Graham participated in exactly as much as he'd agreed to participate in the table, which was to say he was there and useful when specific questions about the ranch or the property came up, and otherwise kept quiet. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When it was done, Margaret had agreed to fabricate a trial order of 12 custom axle brackets for Northern Supply, with a follow-up order pending quality assessment. She shook Holt's hand, and he left, and Margaret turned to Graham with her hands resting on the edge of the display table and said, "That should be enough." Graham was quiet for a moment. "Should be," he said. "I don't deal in certainties." She began carefully wrapping the remaining display pieces in the burlap. "But the numbers add up." "When did you add them up?" "About an hour ago. I needed to know what we needed from the Holt conversation before I could finish it properly." She folded the burlap with neat, even folds. "We're still short by a specific amount if we only count today's cash sales. The Dellard deposit covers half of it. The Holt trial order covers the other half if I can complete it on schedule, and the bank will have to accept a partial payment now with the contract documentation as security on the remainder." "Will they accept that?" "I don't know," she said, "but it's a reasonable arrangement, more reasonable than foreclosure and a distressed sale." She packed the wrapped pieces into the wagon box. "We'll need to make the case to Carson directly. Tomorrow. Tomorrow's Christmas Day." "I know." She didn't stop packing. "Does Carson strike you as a man who observes the holiday?" Graham thought about Warren Carson, his careful suits, his careful language, the way he'd stopped making eye contact. "He's at the bank on Christmas Day if Victor Caldwell asks him to be." "Then we'll be there first." Graham helped her finish loading the wagon. The market was winding down around them, vendors packing up, the crowd thinning as the afternoon light went flat and cold. Somewhere on the platform behind them, a train was preparing to depart, and the whistle sounded across the freight yard with a long carrying note. He looked at what was left on the wagon, fewer pieces than they'd arrived with, which was the whole point, and a notebook full of orders and deposits and a contract conversation that would need a letter to formalize. "Margaret," he said. She was securing the tarp. "When you answered the advertisement," he started, then stopped. She waited. "You said you'd spent 22 years running the shop, after Thomas died. Why—" He tried to find the shape of the question. "Why the advertisement? You could have kept the business." Margaret tied the last corner of the tarp and didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness that he recognized from listening to her for 36 hours. "I had to leave Granger," she said. "The shop. Thomas's family had a claim on it after he died. Legal dispute. It dragged on for 2 years, and at the end of it, the shop went to his brother." She looked at the wagon, not at Graham. "I had my tools. I had 22 years of skills. I didn't have a place to use them. I'm sorry." "Don't be." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but not cold. "It was hard. I was angry for a long time. But being angry at something you can't change is expensive." She turned to look at him then, directly and without performance. "I wanted to build something that was mine. The advertisement said Montana Frontier, which meant I'd be starting clean without anybody's prior history attached to it." A brief pause. "I didn't know it also meant a broken windmill and a 10-day bank deadline, but the edge of something that wasn't quite a smile. I've worked with worse materials." Graham looked at her in the flat, cold light of the December afternoon, with the sound of the train behind them and the market folding up around them and the wagon loaded with the results of 36 hours of work. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything to say that wouldn't be too much or too little. "We should head back before it gets dark," Margaret said, and climbed up to the wagon seat with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. Graham climbed up beside her and turned the horses toward home. They had 4 hours of road ahead of them, and somewhere on the other side of it, Christmas morning, and a bank that didn't know yet what was coming through its door. The ride back from Helena took longer than 4 hours. One of the horses threw a shoe on the frozen road about 40 minutes out of the city, and Graham pulled the wagon over and spent 20 minutes in the dark working the shoe back onto the hoof, well enough to limp the animal home at a reduced pace. Margaret held the lantern without being asked and positioned it exactly where it needed to be without Graham having to tell her, and when he stood up and brushed the ice off his knees, she handed him the canteen and didn't say anything about the time. They reached the ranch past 11 at night, cold through to the bone and not talking much. Graham saw to the horses while Margaret carried the remaining display pieces into the house, and by the time he came in from the barn, she had a fire going in the kitchen stove and was making something hot from what she'd found in the larder. "Sit," she said when he came through the door. He sat. She put a bowl of something in front of him, mostly dried beans and broth, thickened with a little flour, with the last of the dried beef cut into it. It was not a remarkable meal. It was hot, which was the only thing that mattered. They ate without conversation. The wind had picked up outside, moving through the gaps in the walls with a thin sound, and the fire in the stove talked back to it in the way fires do. After a while, Margaret said, "Tell me about Carson again." Graham looked up from his bowl. "Warren Carson. You said he can barely look you in the eye. How long has that been going on?" "Since early fall, maybe? August, September." He thought about it. "Around the time Victor started showing up at the ranch unannounced. So Caldwell made his move on Carson before he made his move on you." "That's my read. What does Carson want?" She said it not as a rhetorical question, but as a practical one, the kind a person asks when they're working through a problem that has more than one moving part. Graham set his spoon down. "Carson's been bank president for 11 years. He's not a bad man exactly. He's a cautious man, and cautious men in positions like his tend to follow the money when the money has opinions. Does he have anything of his own at stake? Property? Debts?" "The bank holds a note on his brother-in-law's mill," Graham said slowly, as if he were remembering something he hadn't thought about in a while. "Up in Cascade County, the mill's been struggling, timber prices dropped 2 years ago, and the brother-in-law overexpanded. If the bank called that note, the family'd lose the mill." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And if Victor owns the bank's goodwill, then the note on the mill gets handled gently." Graham picked his spoon back up, set it down again without eating. "I never said that out loud before." "Did you know it before?" "I knew the pieces. I didn't—" He stopped. "Victor's not stupid. He doesn't threaten people directly. He arranges things so that people can see for themselves what their choices mean." "Subtler," Margaret said. "Subtler, and harder to fight." Margaret finished her broth. She set the bowl aside and put her hands flat on the table in the gesture Graham had come to recognize as her thinking posture. Not restless, not drumming, just present, both hands in contact with the surface as if she were steadying herself against something. "Then we don't fight Carson," she said. "We give him a different set of choices to look at." "What kind of choices?" "The kind where helping us is better for him than helping Caldwell." She looked at Graham steadily. "If we walk in there tomorrow with cash in hand and a legitimate contract with Northern Supply, Carson has something he can point to. A story that says the mortgage is viable, the operation has income, the foreclosure isn't necessary." She paused. "If Carson forecloses on a ranch that could have been saved, that's a different story for a bank president to carry. Victor will have already talked to him." "Probably. But Victor talked to him when we had nothing. Tomorrow we'll have something." She pulled her hands off the table and stood, picking up the bowls. "It won't be simple. Carson is going to be uncomfortable. He's going to look for reasons why it's not enough. And if he finds one, then we address it." She went to the wash basin with the bowls. "One problem at a time, Graham." He watched her at the basin, the methodical way she washed the bowls, the same focus she brought to ironwork, and thought about what she'd said earlier on the wagon road about leaving Granger, about Thomas's family and the shop, and 2 years of legal dispute that had taken everything she'd built, about being angry at things you can't change being expensive. He'd been angry at the drought, at the bank, at the slow erosion of everything his father had built, and then at his own inability to stop it. He'd spent so much energy on the anger that there hadn't been much left for actual solutions, and somewhere in there the problems had gotten ahead of him in a way that problems do when you're moving slower than they are. "I'm going to sleep," Margaret said. "A few hours. I want to be at the bank when it opens." "It's Christmas Day. It might not open." If Carson is in Caldwell's pocket, he'll open it when Caldwell calls. She dried her hands on the cloth by the basin. And Caldwell saw us at the market today. He knows what we made. He's not going to sit still. So we have to be there first. We have to be there first, she confirmed. She went to her room. Graham sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, doing the arithmetic one more time. The day's cash sales, the Dellard deposit, the Holt trial order, the remaining balance on the banknote, the gap between what they had and what they needed. The numbers moved differently than they had that morning. They didn't add up perfectly, but they added up to an argument which was more than he'd had in months. He went to bed. He slept 4 hours, which was better than he'd expected. He was up at 5:30, and Margaret was already in the kitchen with coffee on and her coat over the back of the chair, her notebook open on the table with figures written in 2 columns. She didn't look up when he came in. "The Holt order," she said. "I need to write the terms down formally before we go to the bank. I need you to look at them and tell me if I've described the ranch's capability correctly." He sat down and looked at the notebook. She'd written the terms of the Northern Supply Arrangement in clear, compressed sentences: quantity, specifications, delivery schedule, payment terms, penalty conditions. It was the kind of document a lawyer might have drafted, except a lawyer would have used 3 times the words for the same information. "This says delivery by March 15th, he said. "Is that achievable?" He thought about it. The forge would need to be running consistently. The coal supply was limited but could be replenished. The actual fabrication, 12 custom axle brackets to specific dimensions, was Margaret's work, not his, and he was in no position to estimate how long it would take her. "How long for the brackets?" he asked. 3 weeks if the iron stock holds. 4 if I have to wait on a delivery." She picked up her coffee. "Call it 4 to be safe." "Then March 15th is achievable." "I thought so, but I wanted you to confirm the ranch side of it." She made a small notation. "The equipment, the supply lines, whether there are any factors I'm not accounting for." "There's the windmill," Graham said. "If we lose the water supply for any extended period in deep winter, it affects everything, including how much time I can spend helping you at the forge rather than hauling water by hand." "I know, that's why the windmill repair is the first thing after today." She made another notation. "I want to attempt the shaft splice this week. I need 2 more pieces from the hardware supplier in Mill Haven, but I can work around them for the initial repair and add them when they're available." "You planned this already?" "I started planning it on the wagon back from Helena." She said it without any particular emphasis, as if planning ironwork timelines on a 4-hour night drive in the cold was a normal thing to do. For her, Graham was starting to understand, it probably was. They left for Helena at 6:30 while it was still dark. The repaired horse was moving normally, which was a relief, and the road was cold but dry. Margaret rode with her notebook in her coat pocket and her hands in her lap, not talking much, but Graham had learned the difference between her silences. There was the silence of someone thinking, and the silence of someone who had finished thinking and was simply waiting, and this morning she had the second kind. They reached Helena at 9 o'clock. The city had a muted quality on Christmas morning, fewer people on the streets, the market platform cleared and empty, the usual noise of commerce reduced to something quieter. A few families moved along the boardwalks, and here and there a shop showed a light in the window, but most of the city was doing what cities do on holidays. First Territorial Bank was on the main street, a solid brick building with the bank's name in iron letters above the door. The door was locked. Graham tried the handle once, more to confirm than out of any real hope, and then looked at Margaret. "Give it 20 minutes, she said. They waited in the wagon. Graham watched the bank's front windows. Margaret read back through her notebook, making occasional small marks. At 9:22, a light appeared in the back of the bank. At 9:31, Warren Carson came to the front door, looked out through the glass, saw the wagon, and went very still. Graham could see his face clearly enough. Carson was a careful-looking man in his late 50s, with the particular grooming of someone who used his appearance as a form of professional armor. Hair precisely combed, coat precisely buttoned. He looked at the wagon with the expression of someone who had been told to expect a problem and was now confronted with the problem being slightly larger than described. He opened the door. "Mr. Holloway," he said. His voice had the quality Graham remembered, pleasant on the surface and working hard to stay that way. "I didn't expect Christmas Day." "I know it is, Warren." Graham stepped down from the wagon. "We need to talk." Carson's eyes moved to Margaret. "And this is Margaret Ellison." She climbed down from the wagon with her notebook in hand. "I'm the new smith at the Holloway Ranch. I'd like to show you some documentation." Carson opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. This isn't a regular bank day. I was only here to catch up on some paperwork," Margaret said pleasantly. "Good. So are we." There was a moment, brief, charged, where Carson clearly weighed the option of simply refusing. Graham watched him do it, and then Carson stepped back from the door and let them in. The bank's interior smelled of coal heat and old paper. Carson led them past the teller cages to his office at the back, a room with a large desk and 2 chairs opposite it, and a window that looked onto the alley behind the building. The foreclosure notice on Graham's property was visible in the open file on Carson's desk, which told Graham everything about what Warren Carson had been doing in his office on Christmas morning. "Sit down," Carson said, in the tone of a man who'd decided that being formal was safer than being human. They sat. Margaret put her notebook on the desk and opened it to the figures page without preamble. "I want to walk you through the ranch's current income picture," she said. Carson looked at the notebook, then at Margaret, then at Graham, with an expression that said, "Who is this woman and what is she doing in my bank?" "The note is in default," Carson said. "The figures at this point, the note is in default as of today," Margaret said. "We're here to address that." She turned the notebook so it faced Carson and pointed to the first column. "Cash income from the Helena Station market yesterday. The amounts are itemized. The deposit from Mr. Frank Dillard of the DD Ranch for a commissioned gate, collected and documented, and the terms of a supply contract with Northern Supply, represented by Mr. Holt, for a trial order of custom fabricated hardware, with follow-up orders contingent on delivery." Carson looked at the figures. He looked at them for longer than was strictly necessary, which told Graham he was actually reading them rather than just performing the motion of reading. "This cash amount," Carson said, "combined with the deposit, it's not the full balance." "No," Margaret said. "It's approximately 70% of the outstanding balance. The remainder is secured by the Northern Supply contract, which has a first payment due upon delivery of the trial order in March. The bank requires full payment. The bank requires full payment or a viable repayment arrangement," Margaret said. "Mr. Holloway's mortgage agreement, which I've read, specifies that the bank may negotiate alternative arrangements at the president's discretion in cases where the borrower demonstrates active good faith efforts toward repayment." Carson's expression shifted slightly. "You've read the mortgage agreement." "I read it last night." Carson looked at Graham. Graham looked back at him steadily without saying anything, because Margaret was handling this and he was smart enough to know it. "The bank has concerns about the ranch's long-term viability," Carson said, moving to different ground. "The cattle operation has been declining for 3 years. The infrastructure is being repaired," Margaret said. "The forge is operational as of 48 hours ago. The windmill repair begins this week. A formal operating plan," she produced a folded paper from the notebook's back cover, "is here." Carson looked at the paper. It was 3 pages, Graham realized. She'd written an operating plan in the notebook during the drive back from Helena and copied it fair on paper sometime in the night. This was prepared. "Yesterday and last night," Margaret said. "Yes." Another silence. Carson was doing something behind his careful expression that Graham couldn't fully read, but that felt like a man trying to find the door he'd left open and discovering it wasn't where he'd left it. "I'll need to consult with—" Carson stopped. "With Mr. Caldwell?" Margaret said. The temperature in the room changed. Carson's face went through 3 things in about 2 seconds. Graham watched all of them. "I don't know why you'd suggest," Carson started. "Because he came to the market yesterday," Margaret said, still in the same even conversational tone. "He saw what we made. He knows we're here today. And you were in this office on Christmas morning before we arrived, which means someone called you." She paused. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Carson. I'm saying I understand the position you're in." Carson was very still. "The note on your brother-in-law's mill," Margaret said quietly. "In Cascade County." Whatever color had been in Carson's face went somewhere else. "That's," he began. "That's a separate matter," Margaret said, "and it should stay that way. The Holloway Ranch mortgage is this matter. I'm asking you to evaluate it on its own terms. She put her hand flat on the notebook. The same gesture Graham had seen at the kitchen table, steady, present. If this ranch is viable, and the figures in front of you suggest it is, then the right decision for the bank is a negotiated arrangement, not a forced sale at distressed prices. A forced sale helps one buyer at one price. A recovered operation services this mortgage for another 20 years. Carson looked at his desk, at the foreclosure file, at the notebook with its careful columns, at the operating plan. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, someone walked past the alley window. A family, from the sound of it. Children's voices briefly, and then gone. I can't approve this unilaterally, Carson said finally. The board doesn't meet until the new year, Margaret said. We're asking you to extend the foreclosure deadline by 30 days on the basis of a partial payment today and the documentation in front of you. That's within your authority as president. Who told you? The mortgage agreement specifies it, Margaret said. Section 4, paragraph 3. President's discretionary extension provision. Graham looked at her sideways. He hadn't known that clause existed. He was fairly sure Carson had hoped he didn't. Carson picked up the operating plan and read it properly this time, not performing the motion but actually reading. Graham watched his eyes move down the pages. 3 pages, written in the night, with specific figures and timelines and the kind of detail that required you to know what you were talking about. The forge income projection, Carson said. This assumes a consistent client base. The market yesterday was 1 day, Margaret said. The Dellard contract is documented. The Holt arrangement is documented. The inquiry list, she turned to another page in the notebook, is 11 names, people who asked for the ranch address or left contact information for follow-up orders. Carson looked at the list. He sat back in his chair. Graham thought about what Margaret had said the night before. We give him a different set of choices to look at. He could see Carson looking at them now, weighing them with the careful arithmetic of a man trying to figure out which direction the weight came down. 30 days, Carson said finally. I can authorize a 30-day extension on the basis of the partial payment and this documentation. The remaining balance plus interest must be received within that period. And the mortgage is reinstated upon full payment, Margaret said. No additional penalties, no modification of terms. Carson hesitated. The interest that has accrued is included in the figures I've presented, Margaret said. I calculated it using the rate specified in the original agreement. Another pause. Yes, Carson said. Reinstated upon full payment, terms unchanged. Margaret extended her hand across the desk. Carson looked at it for a moment, then shook it, and Graham thought he saw something in Carson's expression that might have been relief. The specific relief of a man who had been given permission to do the thing he'd known was right. They completed the paperwork at Carson's desk. Graham produced the cash and the Dellard deposit receipt and signed the extension agreement, and Carson stamped and signed his copy with the deliberate care of a man making sure he had done things in the correct order. Outside on the boardwalk in front of the bank, Graham stood for a moment in the cold Christmas morning air and felt something moving through his chest that took him a moment to identify. Not relief. Not yet. 30 days was 30 days, and they still had a long way to go. But possibility. A thing that had been closed was open again. Even a little open was different from closed. Carson won't tell Caldwell right away, Margaret said beside him. He'll be careful about how he does it. Victor's going to be angry. Yes. She didn't sound particularly troubled by this. Angry men make mistakes. Careful men who are angry make more mistakes than they usually do. She looked up the empty Christmas morning street. We need to get back. I want to start on the windmill collar today. It's Christmas. She glanced at him. You want to rest? He thought about it honestly. His back ached from the wagon ride. His hands were cold and tired from yesterday. The normal thing, the human thing, would be to take the day. No, he said. Neither do I. She started toward the wagon. I'll need the broken shaft brought to the forge when we get back. And I need to know where you keep the heavy chain, the long length, because the rigging for the windmill repair is going to need a good anchor point. Back of the equipment shed, he said, following her, hanging on the east wall. Does it have any rust on the links? Some, not bad. I'll check it before we use it. She climbed up to the wagon seat. And Graham? He climbed up beside her. Yeah. You did the right thing coming to the bank today instead of waiting. He looked at her. It wasn't the kind of statement she made often. Not encouragement for its own sake. Not comfort delivered because the moment seemed to call for it. She said it the way she said things that were simply true. You did the work, he said. We did the work. She took the reins. The distinction matters. He let her drive, which surprised him a little since he'd always driven on his own roads. She handled the horses the way she handled everything, without excess movement, without drama, with the confidence of someone who had figured out where the edges were and stayed well inside them. They were out of Helena and onto the road home when Graham spoke again. Caldwell's going to come at us differently now, he said. Whatever he was planning before, losing this angle, he'll try something else. I know. He's not going to accept that the ranch is out of reach and move on to the next property. No, the water rights are too valuable. She kept her eyes on the road. What would you do? If you were him and your first approach failed? Graham considered it. I'd look for a different kind of pressure, something that doesn't go through the bank. He thought about the Harrises, young couple, the barn that had burned. Something less official. Legal or otherwise. Victor prefers legal, more defensible. Graham shifted on the seat. But the people he uses to apply pressure aren't always as careful as he is. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The ranch hands you had before, the ones who left when wages stopped. Any of them likely to work for Caldwell if he offered? It was a question Graham hadn't thought to ask himself, and the fact that Margaret had thought to ask it unsettled him in a way that had nothing to do with her. One, maybe, he said slowly. Richie Tate. He left angry, said things on his way out that Graham stopped. He's not a bad man exactly, but he's got a temper and he likes money. Is Caldwell the kind of person who finds men like that? Yes, Graham said. He is. Then we should know where Tate is. She said it practically, without drama. Not to do anything, just to know. Graham thought about that. About the specific kind of threat that had no paperwork attached to it, that couldn't be answered with a notebook full of figures and a 3-page operating plan. Victor Caldwell, at his careful worst, was manageable, maybe. Victor Caldwell using people like Richie Tate was a different thing. I'll ask around, he said. Don't be obvious about it. I know how to ask around quietly. I've lived in this territory for 60 years. She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in it. Not quite a smile, not a smile. Fair point, she said. The road home ran along the base of a long ridge for about 6 miles, and in the middle section where the terrain dropped away to the south, you could see the whole sweep of the valley, ranches and fence lines and the frozen creek bed threading through it, with the mountains behind everything. Graham knew this view as well as he knew anything. He'd driven this road in every season and every weather, and he'd watched the valley change over 30 years from something wild at the edges to something that was trying to become orderly without quite managing it. He looked at it now and thought about Victor's plan. The eastern watershed, the water rights, the slow strangling of 6 ranches from a single choke point, and felt the anger that he usually tried to keep at a careful distance because it was expensive, the way Margaret had said. He's going to keep coming, Graham said. Yes. Even with the extension, even with this contract, even if we make full payment in 30 days, he's going to find another angle. Almost certainly. So what do we do about that? Margaret drove for a moment without answering. The ridge threw a shadow across the road, and the horses adjusted their pace slightly going into the chill of it. We build something he can't easily take apart, she said. Not just income. Relationships. Clients who depend on the forge, who have a stake in it running. Community standing that makes attacking the ranch look like attacking the community. She paused. Caldwell buys land from isolated people. Isolated operations are easy targets. Operations with connections are harder. We've only been at this 2 days. I know. 2 days is a start, not a finish. She looked at the road ahead. Frank Dellard knows everyone in this valley. He's been ranching here longer than almost anyone. If Dellard's work is coming out of our forge, people notice. And the Holt contract with Northern Supply means we're connected to the supply routes. 6 wagon teams. That's a lot of people who know the ranch's name. She was quiet for a moment. Caldwell is powerful because he's organized. He sees the whole board. Most of the people he takes from only see their own corner of it. She glanced at Graham. We need to see more of the board. He thought about that all the way home. The ranch looked the same when they pulled into the yard. The same worn buildings, the same dormant vegetable patch, the same empty corral where the larger cattle crew had once worked. The windmill tower stood against the cold sky with its broken arms still down, a monument to what hadn't been attended to. But something was different. Graham couldn't have said precisely what. Maybe it was just the way he was looking at it. He unhitched the horses and fed them, while Margaret changed out of her good coat and into her work clothes. When she came out to the forge lean-to, he had the broken windmill shaft already pulled from the debris pile and laid on the ground beside the forge. She crouched and examined the crack with her fingers the way she had on that first morning, probing, tapping, reading the metal with her hands the way some people read text. "It's clean," she said. "The fracture is clean. I can work with this." "Today?" "I want to get the collar started. The full repair needs the pieces from Mill Haven, but I can prepare the shaft and make the basic collar today." She stood up. "It won't be pretty." "Will it hold?" "For 20 years," she said. "Maybe more." She pulled her work apron from the hook on the wall and tied it around her. "Get the fire going. I need it hot in 20 minutes. Graham started the fire. He was getting better at it, knowing how much coal to start with, how to build the bed, how to read the color of the heat. He wasn't a smith and probably never would be, but he was learning the grammar of the forge the way you learn any language when you're immersed in it, not through study, but through constant exposure. The fire caught, the bellows breathed, the heat built. Margaret was already working. Outside, beyond the lean-to's open side, the Montana afternoon was doing what December afternoons did, going dark early, the cold deepening as the light went flat. Somewhere out on the range, the cattle were pressing together against it, and the creek was frozen, and the windmill stood broken against the sky. But the forge was burning, and a woman who knew what she was doing stood in front of it, and Graham Holloway was learning, slowly, inadequately, but genuinely, that there was a difference between a situation that was impossible and a situation that was just very hard. The collar began to take shape under Margaret's hammer. It was not a graceful process. Iron doesn't cooperate because you need it to. It cooperates because you've applied the right heat and the right force in the right sequence. And even then it has its own opinion about what shape it wants to be. And sometimes the opinion is wrong and you have to heat it again and correct it. And the correction isn't smooth. And the piece ends up with marks on it that a perfectly made piece wouldn't have. Margaret looked at those marks without apology. "That's what working iron looks like," she said. "Anyone who tells you different is selling you something." Graham looked at the collar, rough in places, showing the evidence of its making, but solid. Genuinely solid, the kind of solid you could feel just by looking at the thickness of the joins. "Does it matter?" he asked. "The marks?" "Not to the windmill." She turned this piece and checked the interior curve. "It matters to people who think beauty and function are separate things. They're not, usually. But for structural work, what matters is whether it holds." "Will it?" She set the collar down on the anvil and looked at it for a moment with the particular attention she used when she was being honest with herself about something. "Yes," she said. "It'll hold." The fire crackled, the wind pushed at the lean-to's walls. And somewhere to the north, in a city that was celebrating Christmas in the way cities do, Victor Caldwell was sitting with the news from the bank and rearranging his plans around an obstacle he hadn't anticipated. Graham didn't know exactly what Victor would do next. He didn't know if 30 days would be enough, or if the Northern Supply contract would come through cleanly, or if Richie Tate was somewhere close and working for the wrong person. What he knew was that the forge was hot, and the collar was taking shape, and Margaret Ellison was standing in front of the anvil on Christmas Day, repairing what had been broken, the way she repaired everything, without ceremony, without the pretense that it was easy, and without any apparent intention of stopping. He picked up the tongs. "What do you need?" he asked. She handed him a length of rod without looking up from the piece. "Hold that steady," she said. He held it steady. The windmill collar held. Margaret had said it would, and it did, but Graham still stood at the base of the tower on the morning of December 27th, with his hand on the repaired shaft, and felt the absence of wobble with something close to disbelief. He'd watched her install it the previous afternoon, the rigging, the careful positioning, the final seating of the collar over the splice, and he'd done everything she asked him to do, which was considerable, but the actual repair was hers in the way that the market display had been hers and the bank conversation had been hers. He was learning to recognize the difference between participating in something and being responsible for it. The water was running again, not full flow. The trough had frozen overnight and needed breaking before the cattle could drink. But the mechanism was turning, the pump was cycling, and the particular silence that a broken windmill creates, that absence of familiar sound, was replaced by the creak and turn he'd grown up hearing. He broke the ice on the trough with the back of an axe and watched the cattle come to it and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for weeks. Margaret came out of the forge, lean-to, wiping her hands on her work cloth. She looked at the windmill without breaking stride, assessed it in one glance, and said, "The upper bracket needs watching. I want to check it again in 3 days." "It's working," Graham said. "It's working now. The splice is sound, but the bracket I fabricated from the existing material is 1 generation removed from the original spec. 3 days? Check it." "All right." She went back to the forge. Graham stood a moment longer by the trough, watching the cattle drink in the cold morning light, and thought about the 30-day window that was now 28 days and counting. The week between Christmas and the New Year moved the way that week always does in hard country. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the specific density of cold days that demand constant attention and offer nothing back except the satisfaction of getting through them. Margaret worked the forge every day, starting before Graham was fully awake and stopping only when the light failed completely or the coal supply needed managing. The orders from the market were being worked through systematically. Hooks, latches, the hardware sets that multiple buyers had requested, a set of custom cabinet pulls for a furniture maker in Helena who'd sent a letter by way of the Millhaven Post. Graham did his own work in parallel. The cattle needed daily attention in the cold, feed, water, checking for any animals showing signs of weakness. The secondary barn roof needed the patching he'd been putting off since October, and with the weight of snow that had come in after Christmas, it couldn't wait any longer. He spent a full day on the roof with lumber and tar paper and cold fingers, working down from the ridge and doing it in the way he'd learned from his father. Not perfectly, not like a professional roofer would have done it, but solidly, with enough overlap on the patches that the water had nowhere easy to go. He found Richie Tate on the 3rd day of the new year. Not found exactly. He'd asked around quietly, the way he'd told Margaret he would, putting questions into conversations at the Millhaven General Store and the feed supplier without making them sound like questions. The answer came back in pieces over several days. Tate was in the area, working occasional days for a property management operation out of Helena. The property management operation had a business address but almost no visible business, and the name on the lease for the office space was a holding company Graham didn't recognize, but that was registered. This he found out from a contact at the county records office, a man named Dutch who owed Graham a favor from a fence dispute they'd both been involved in years ago, to an entity called Caldwell Land Associates. He told Margaret over dinner. She listened without interrupting, then said, "How close is Tate to the ranch?" "He's been seen in Millhaven twice in the last week. That's 12 miles. "What does the property management operation actually do?" "As far as I can tell, it holds paperwork and waits." Graham turned his fork over in his hand. "Dutch says there are 3 other names associated with the holding company. All of them have done work for Victor over the years." "What kind of work?" "The kind that doesn't go in writing." He set the fork down. "I'm not saying Tate would do anything violent. He's got a temper, but he's not stupid enough to—" He stopped. "I don't know what he'd do. He was angrier than I realized when he left." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything on this property that could be damaged without being obviously deliberately damaged?" Graham looked at her. It was a specific kind of question, the kind that came from someone who had thought through a problem past the point where most people stopped. "The forge," he said slowly. "The coal supply. It's stored in the shed, not under lock. If someone got at the coal and damaged it or took it, we lose production time. Same with the iron stock. The windmill. The repairs new. If someone knew what to look for, knew where the splice was, they could work the bracket loose without it being obvious." Margaret nodded, not with alarm, but with the focused attention of someone adding an item to a list. "I want a lock on the coal shed. I can get one from Millhaven tomorrow. I also want to know if anyone comes onto this property." She said it straightforwardly, without dramatics. "I don't mean alarm systems. I mean, is there a neighbor who can see the road? Anyone who would notice a strange horse or wagon coming through?" Graham thought about it. Ed Ferris, 3 miles east. He's on his porch most mornings. Retired, keeps irregular hours. He'd notice. Would he tell you if he saw something? If I asked him to, yes. Ed's a good man. He doesn't have any connection to Caldwell that I know of. Ask him tomorrow, when you go to Mill Haven. She stood and carried her plate to the basin. And don't make it sound like you're worried. Just tell him you've had some trouble with trespassers. That's more or less true. It's exactly true. She started washing up. Victor hasn't done anything directly yet. We're just making sure we know if he starts. Graham watched her at the basin. He'd been watching her for a week and a half now, and he was still finding things that surprised him. Not dramatic surprises, not the kind that arrived with a bang, but the quiet kind, the kind that accumulated. The way she dealt with problems. She didn't talk about them until she'd thought them through. She didn't express worry as worry. She expressed it as preparation. Whatever she was anxious about, she turned into something she could do something about, and if there was nothing to do about it, she seemed to genuinely set it aside. He hadn't been able to do that in years. Maybe never. You were always like this? He asked. She turned from the basin. Like what? He tried to find the words. This, methodical, thinking ahead, not, he paused, not letting things get to you. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the wash water. Thomas used to say I was the least emotional person he'd ever met, she said finally. He didn't mean it as a compliment exactly. He meant I was sometimes hard to reach. She went back to the washing. I'm not unemotional. I learned early that being upset is expensive, and I had things I needed to spend my energy on. A pause. The shop had 8 different crises in the first 5 years. Equipment failures, bad debts, one fire, small, but still. Thomas dealt with the crises by being very upset and very loud about them, which was actually useful sometimes because people paid attention to him. I dealt with them by trying to fix them. She put a plate in the drying rack. We were a good pair that way. Graham got up and took a towel and started drying the plate she'd just set in the rack. She glanced at him, but didn't say anything about it. Did he know what you were worth? Graham asked. The question came out more direct than he'd intended, and he regretted it immediately, but Margaret didn't flinch. Mostly, she said. He had his moments. A brief pause. He sometimes introduced me to people as my wife who knows the forge better than I do, and the way he said it was half proud and half uncomfortable, like he hadn't fully made peace with it even after 20 years. She handed Graham another plate. Most men hadn't, in that time and place. Some still haven't. I noticed your work before I'd met you 30 seconds, Graham said. On the wagon in from the station, you saw the fence posts. You noticed my competence, she said. That's not the same as being easy with it. He thought about that. Fair, he said. She handed him the last plate and pulled the wash basin. They finished the dishes without speaking, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the one that had taken about 3 days to arrive and had been there most of the time since. On the 6th of January, Holt arrived from Northern Supply. Graham saw the wagon coming up the road from the ranch yard and didn't immediately recognize it, and for one cold moment thought it was Victor or someone connected to him. The particular alertness that had become habitual in the last 2 weeks tightening in his chest before he identified the Northern Supply lettering on the wagon's side panel. He went to get Margaret. She came out of the forge with her apron on and met Holt at the yard gate with the same unhurried directness she'd shown at the market. Holt was a practical man who didn't waste time on pleasantries. He'd said so at the market, and he demonstrated it now, getting straight to the point about the trial order. I need the brackets by the 15th of March, he said. I told you that in Helena. I have it in writing, Margaret confirmed. I want to see the forge. He said it without apology. I don't commit supply contracts to operations I haven't seen working. Margaret looked at him steadily. Come and look then. She walked him to the forge lean-to and Graham followed, watching Holt's face as he came in and looked around. At the anvil, the forge itself, the organized bench with finished pieces arranged by type, the tool wall where Margaret's tools hung in the sequence she used them. Holt picked up one of the completed hook sets from the bench. He worked it in his hands the way Dellard had at the market, with the tactile intelligence of someone who handled physical things for a living and had learned to read them. You're making the axle brackets in what stock? He asked. 3/4-inch square bar for the main arm, 1/2-inch round for the secondary bracing, Margaret said. The specs your man wrote out are on the bench there. I've been working to those dimensions. Holt looked at the specs. He looked at the forge. He set the hook down. Show me a test piece, he said. Margaret was already at the forge. She'd banked it before coming out to the yard, and it came back to heat quickly. She worked the demonstration piece in front of him, not a full axle bracket, which would have taken 2 hours, but a section of the primary arm to the correct dimensions with the correct joint type, done in the time it took Holt to finish his visual survey of the space and come back to the anvil. He held the finished test section and applied force to it in the direction a loaded axle would stress it. He applied more force. He applied the kind of force that was clearly beyond what any wagon axle would generate in normal operation. The piece didn't move. Holt set it on the bench. All right, he said. March 15th, all 12. If they're right, we'll talk about the standing order. He left without much more ceremony than he'd arrived with, and Graham stood in the forge doorway watching his wagon go back down the road and felt the particular sensation of a thing becoming real that had previously only been a plan. Standing order, he said. If the trial delivers, Margaret said. She was already back at the forge, feeding the fire back up to working heat, which it will. How many pieces in a standing order? Holt mentioned 24 per quarter when we talked in Helena. I didn't put it in the trial agreement, too presumptuous at that stage, but that's the number. She worked the bellows steadily. 24 per quarter, plus whatever else they need on an ACE-requested basis. Graham did the arithmetic. It was a number that changed things, not enormously, not all at once, but in the sustained way that reliable income changes things, month after month, quarter after quarter. That's a business, he said. Yes, Margaret said. That's the point. The second week of January brought 2 developments that arrived within 2 days of each other, in the way that things in frontier life tended to cluster, never one problem at a time, never one piece of good news unaccompanied by something else requiring attention. The first was a letter from Frank Dillard, delivered by his foreman who was coming through the area anyway on other business. The letter confirmed the gate commission in writing, specified the dimensions and design elements Dillard wanted, and included a note at the bottom in Dillard's cramped handwriting. I have spoken to several neighboring ranchers about your operation, and they have expressed interest. With your permission, I will share your address. 3 of them need significant repair work. Graham read this letter aloud to Margaret at breakfast. She listened, then said, Write back today. Tell him yes, and thank him. And ask him to mention the windmill bracket work specifically. Ranchers in this territory have windmill problems, and they need to know someone local can handle the repair. Graham wrote the letter. The second development was not a letter. It was Ed Ferris arriving at the ranch yard on foot on the morning of January 8th, which was unusual because Ed Ferris did not walk 3 miles in the winter without good reason. Graham saw him coming up the road and met him at the gate. Someone was on your south fence line last night, Ed said. He was a thin man in his 70s with wind-burned skin and the direct eyes of someone who had stopped wasting words sometime around the age of 40. 2 men. Horses. I couldn't see clearly in the dark, but they were on your fence line, not the road. What time? Around midnight. I was up. Sleep comes and goes these days. Saw the shapes moving along the ridge. He paused. They didn't come onto the property that I could see, but they were looking at it. Did you recognize the horses? Not at that distance. Another pause. One of them was big, unusual size. Might have been a draft cross. Graham thought about Richie Tate, who had always ridden a big roan draft cross that he'd bought from a man in Cascade County and been disproportionately proud of. All right, he said carefully. Thank you, Ed. You want me to keep watching? If you don't mind. Gives me something to do. Ed turned and started back up the road, then stopped. Be careful with whatever you've got stored in your outbuildings. If they were looking at it last night, they're thinking about something. He went back the way he came. Graham stood at the gate for a moment, then went to find Margaret. She was at the forge. He told her what Ed had said, and she listened without stopping work. She was mid-process on something that couldn't be interrupted, and when he finished, she drove the hammer twice more before setting it down. The coal shed, she said. I got the lock. It's on. I want to move the iron stock. She looked at him. Not all of it, but the higher value pieces, the stock I ordered specifically for the Holt brackets. I want those inside the house. They're heavy. I know. Tonight. She picked the hammer back up. I also want a dog. Graham blinked. A dog. A working dog. Something that barks at strangers and means it. Does anyone around here have a litter? As a matter of fact, Pete Brannigan over on the Creek Road had mentioned his healer had pups in December. Graham had not thought about this information again until this moment. I can probably get one, he said. Get two, she said. One for the yard, one that can sleep by the forge. He wasn't sure two healer pups constituted a security system, but Margaret had said it with the tone she used for things she'd already thought through past the objection stage, and he'd learned to trust that tone. He got the dogs. Two healer pups from Brannigan, 7 weeks old, one red and one blue, both with the particular intense focus that healers have from the time they can walk. Margaret named them on the spot. The red one she called Bolt, the blue one Rivet, and then went back to the forge and left Graham to deal with the immediate puppy chaos, which was considerable. Over the following days, the puppies attached themselves to the property with the territorial conviction of animals who have decided that a place belongs to them. Bolt took the yard. Rivet adopted the forge lean-to and Margaret's feet, specifically, as her domain, following Margaret at a distance of approximately 18 inches whenever Margaret moved between the forge and the house. Graham found this arrangement more comforting than he'd expected. Not because of any illusion that two healer pups were going to stop a determined man, but because the noise they made at anything unfamiliar meant he stopped lying awake listening for sounds he might have missed. On January 11th, Victor Caldwell came to the ranch. He didn't send notice. He arrived mid-morning in a good buggy with a driver, dressed in the same careful way he always was, and he came through the gate without honking or calling out, which Graham knew was deliberate. Victor liked to arrive before you decided how to receive him. Bolt announced him from 40 yards out, standing in the middle of the yard road with every hair on her back raised and a voice that was much larger than her body, and by the time Victor's driver pulled the buggy to a stop, Graham was already standing by the barn door and Margaret had come out of the forge. Victor took in the scene, the dogs, the two of them standing at separate ends of the yard, the forge smoke, and his expression was perfectly pleasant and entirely unreadable. "Morning," he said, stepping down from the buggy. "I wanted to see how things were going." "They're going fine," Graham said. Victor looked at the windmill, at the turning mechanism, the pump cycling. He looked long enough that there was no question he understood what he was seeing. "You got the windmill running," he said. "Fixed the shaft. New collar." Victor's eyes moved to Margaret. "Your work?" "Yes," she said. He walked toward the forge lean-to in the casual way he had of moving into spaces as if invited. Graham stayed where he was. Margaret stepped to the side of the lean-to door, not blocking it, but positioned. Victor stopped at the threshold. He looked at the forge, the bench, the organized workspace. He looked at the row of completed pieces for the Holt order, 12 of the 20 brackets done and lined up on the back bench. "Axle brackets?" he said. "Supply contract," Margaret said simply. Victor turned to look at her directly. It was the look he'd used at the market, appraising, comfortable, the look of a man who was used to being the most prepared person in any conversation. "I heard you went to see Carson on Christmas morning," he said. "We did," Graham said from behind him. Victor turned. He was careful about not being caught between two people. Graham saw him position himself sideways so both of them were in his sight line, which was a small tell. "Warren extended your deadline," Victor said. "A month?" 20 days left, Graham said. 20 days. Victor nodded. "And you're working the forge and meeting supply contracts," he paused. "That's impressive for 10 days' work." 12 days, Margaret said. Something in Victor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not anger. Victor didn't show anger directly. Something colder, more precise. "The thing about supply contracts," Victor said conversationally, "is that they depend on delivery. If something disrupts your production schedule, material delays, equipment trouble, the contract terms come into play." He said it the way he said most things, as information, not threat. "I've seen operations overcommit on new contracts and the penalties end up worse than the income." "I appreciate the concern," Margaret said, in a tone that made it clearly understood that she did not. "The production schedule is on track." "Good." Victor looked at the windmill one more time. "And the shaft repair, a collar splice, was it? I've seen those done wrong. If the bracket work isn't precise, I check it every 3 days, Margaret said. It's precise. The two of them looked at each other, and Graham watched it and thought about what Margaret had said in the kitchen, that Victor was used to dealing with isolated people who could only see their own corner of the board. He was trying to read Margaret and finding it difficult, which was a thing Graham had noticed Victor didn't handle well. What is it you actually want? Graham asked. Victor looked at him. I'm a neighbor, Victor said. I came to see how you were getting on. You don't make social calls, Graham said. You make assessments. What are you assessing? The pleasantness in Victor's expression thinned to its actual structure, which was considerably less warm. I want to know if you're serious, Victor said. About the ranch, about all of this. He gestured at the forge, at Margaret, at the working windmill. Because if you're serious and it's working, that's one situation. If this is a short-term patch to get through the bank deadline before things go back to the way they were, that's another. And if we're serious, Graham asked, then I'd rather be a partner than an adversary, Victor said. I have capital. I have connections in Helena and Billings. A forge operation with the right backing could be. We don't want your capital, Margaret said. Victor looked at her. And we're not going to want it in a month either, she continued. What we want is for you to do your business and let us do ours. A pause. And for whoever you sent to look at our fence line on the 8th to not come back. Victor was very still. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Of course not. Margaret's voice was perfectly level. But whoever it was, just pass along that there's nothing useful to see here. The forge is working, the windmill is working, the property is occupied and watched. She looked at Victor steadily. That's the assessment, if that's what you came for. Another silence. Bolt had worked her way up from the yard road and was now sitting approximately 6 feet from Victor's right leg, watching him with the unblinking attention of a dog who has decided something is wrong and is waiting to be proven right or wrong about it. Victor looked down at the dog. You got dogs, he said. Last week, Graham said. Victor reached into his coat and produced a small folded paper and held it out to Graham. My offer, same as before. Fair market for the property before the drought, which is more than you'll get from a forced sale. He said it without heat. I'll leave it with you. Think it over. Graham didn't take the paper. After a moment, Victor set it on the anvil just inside the forge lean-to and walked back to his buggy. The driver turned the horses and they went back down the road, and Graham stood in the yard and watched them go until they were out of sight. He picked up the paper from the anvil and unfolded it. It was the same offer he'd seen before. The ranch, the property, the water rights, at a price that was genuine and fair, and that would buy him a comfortable life somewhere else. He folded it again. Margaret was at the bench, checking the alignment on one of the completed brackets. He's nervous, she said, without looking up. Victor Caldwell is never nervous. He came here personally to assess whether we were actually working. She turned the bracket over, checking the other face. That means someone told him we were, and he didn't entirely believe it, and he needed to see for himself. She set the bracket down. He believed it when he left. He saw the windmill, he saw the forge running, he saw the Holt brackets. A pause. Now he knows he can't wait us out. Which means he'll do something else. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Did you know about this offer before? She nodded toward the paper in his hand. He made it before. Similar terms. And you didn't take it? No. Why not? At the time before... She stopped, reconsidered the question. When things were worse than they are now, that offer would have solved the immediate problem. Graham looked at the folded paper. Because taking it meant Caldwell wins. Not just this ranch, all of them. Because once he has the water rights on this property, the other ranchers in this valley are stuck. He paused. I can be practical about most things. I couldn't be practical about that. Margaret looked at him. I know, she said. On January 15th, a rider came from the county courthouse in Helena carrying a document that Graham had not expected and that changed the shape of things considerably. It was delivered to him in the ranch yard, formally, the way official documents were delivered, the rider asking his name, confirming it, handing over the sealed envelope. Graham opened it at the kitchen table with Margaret watching. It was a notice of complaint filed with the County Water Authority, alleging that the Holloway Ranch's use of the eastern watershed constituted an unlicensed diversion affecting downstream properties. The complaint was filed by Caldwell Land Associates. It called for an immediate review and potential suspension of water access pending investigation. Graham read it twice. Then he handed it to Margaret. She read it once, set it on the table, and was quiet for a full minute. "He can't actually win this," she said finally. "The water rights to this section have been established since your father's time." "He doesn't need to win it," Graham said. "He needs it to take long enough and cost enough that it doesn't matter whether he wins. Legal fees, and time, and distraction from the production schedule. If I'm spending days in Helena at hearings instead of here—" "You're not going to hearings," Margaret said. "I am." Graham looked at her. You're not a lawyer. You're not even—" "I'm a party to the operation of this ranch," she said. "I'm not a lawyer, but I've been through a 2-year property dispute. I know what the early stages look like, and I know which questions to ask." She picked up the complaint and read it again, more carefully. "This is filed with the Water Authority, not the court. The initial response is administrative, not legal. I can handle an administrative response." "Margaret, the production schedule doesn't stop," she said firmly. "The Holt brackets don't stop. You run the ranch, you manage the cattle, you keep the forge supplied. I manage this." She set the document down. "We don't let him divide our attention. That's exactly what this is designed to do." Graham looked at the notice, at the official letterhead and the careful legal language that Victor Caldwell had paid someone skilled to write. "He's coming at us from 3 directions," Graham said. "The bank deadline, the fence line, whatever that was. And now this." "He's a man who covers his angles," Margaret said. "But he's used to people who can only defend one angle at a time." She looked at Graham across the table. "We're defending all 3. He wasn't sure they could. He wasn't sure 1 forge and 43 cattle and 2 healer pups, and 20 days on a bank deadline could hold against Victor Caldwell, applying pressure from multiple directions with significant resources and a bank president in his pocket. But Margaret was already writing, pulling the notebook from her coat, starting a draft response to the Water Authority complaint with the same focused handwriting she used for everything. And Rivet was curled around her feet under the table, and the forge was still hot outside, and the windmill was still turning. Graham got up and went to the stove and put more coffee on. Then he sat back down and picked up his own pen. "Tell me what you need me to write," he said. Margaret slid a page across the table without looking up from her own work. She'd already written the heading on it, a list of the historical water rights documentation he needed to locate from his father's files and the county records he'd need to request. He looked at the list. It was long. It was detailed. It addressed things he wouldn't have thought to address. He picked up the pen and started working through it. The Water Authority response took Margaret 4 days to write. Not 4 days of continuous writing, 4 days of building it the way she built everything, layer by layer, checking each section against the documentation Graham pulled from his father's files. Those files were in a cedar trunk in the back of the main bedroom closet, and Graham hadn't opened them in 6 years. He'd known they were there. He'd told himself he'd go through them when there was time, which was the thing people tell themselves about things they don't want to face. He went through them now. His father had been a careful man with paper. Every land transaction, every water rights registration, every survey and boundary agreement going back to the original homestead claim was filed in order, in labeled envelopes, in a system that reflected the same methodical intelligence Graham now recognized in Margaret's notebook. Like calls to like, he thought, pulling out the original watershed survey from 1871 and handing it across the table. Margaret smoothed it flat and read it without speaking for several minutes. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "My father surveyed the water rights boundary himself. Had it registered with the territorial government before Montana was even a state. And Caldwell's complaint claims an unlicensed diversion." She tapped the survey. "This document is the license. It predates the Water Authority itself by 12 years. She looked up. "He either didn't know this existed or he assumed you didn't know you had it." "More likely the second one," Graham said. "Yes." She went back to writing. "Most people don't know what's in their own files." He counted on that. Graham thought about the cedar trunk sitting in the closet for 6 years while the ranch fell apart around him, while the bank letter accumulated interest and the windmill rusted and the cattle numbers dropped. Everything he'd needed had been there. He just hadn't looked. He didn't say that out loud, but he sat with it. The response Margaret filed with the Water Authority was 22 pages, including attachments: the 1871 survey, the original homestead water registration, 3 subsequent boundary confirmations from county records, and a formal legal opinion she'd managed to obtain by writing a very precise letter to a Helena attorney named Caldwell Cross, who had no relation to Victor and who, it turned out, had a long memory regarding Caldwell Land Associates and their habit of filing administrative complaints against properties they wanted to acquire. Cross had written back within 2 days. His opinion was 3 pages and cost nothing because, as he explained in a note attached to it, he'd been waiting for someone to give him a clean document to write against Caldwell's Water Authority strategy for the better part of a year. Margaret read Cross's note and said, "He's done this before." "Cross?" "Caldwell, the Water Authority complaint. It's not the first time." She looked at the attorney's note again. "Cross has seen this play twice in the last 18 months. Different properties, same filing. It's a standard move, create legal uncertainty, force the target to spend money and time defending a right they already have, wait for the exhaustion to set in. Did it work the other times?" A pause. "Once," she said, "the second property settled, sold to Caldwell Land Associates at below market value 6 weeks after the complaint was filed." She set the note down. "We're not doing that." "No," Graham agreed. The response went to Helena by rider on January 19th, 1 day before the bank deadline. That night, Graham sat at the kitchen table after Margaret had gone to her room and did the arithmetic one final time. The cash from the market. The Dellard deposit. The first payment from Holt, which had arrived 3 days earlier when Graham delivered the initial 6 brackets as a partial delivery, and Holt had paid on receipt, the total. It was enough. Not comfortably enough. Not with anything left over for emergencies or equipment or the kind of cushion that a ranch needed to feel stable, but enough to walk into First Territorial Bank of Helena and put the full remaining balance on Warren Carson's desk. He sat with that number for a while. Then he went to the cedar trunk and pulled out one more document, the original mortgage, in his father's handwriting where his father had signed it, and in his own handwriting where he'd refinanced it after Clara died. He read both signatures. He thought about what they meant and what it had cost to keep that meaning alive. He put the mortgage back in the trunk and went to bed. Drove to Helena on the morning of January 20th. Margaret wore her good coat. Graham wore the jacket he kept for occasions that required something better than his work clothes. Neither of them said much on the road, not the comfortable silence of the last 3 weeks, but something more concentrated, like air before a storm. The bank was open, properly open, with tellers at the cages and the normal business of a January morning going on around them. Carson's office door was closed. Graham told the teller they were there to see the bank president, and the teller went to knock, and there was a pause long enough to tell Graham that Carson had been expecting them and had been deciding something in those few seconds before he called out to send them in. Carson's office looked the same as it had on Christmas morning, same desk, same file, same window onto the alley. But Carson himself looked different. He looked like a man who had spent 3 weeks sleeping poorly, which was a condition Graham recognized from long personal experience. Margaret put the payment on the desk. Cash, the Holt payment receipt, and a document she'd had Cross prepare. A formal acknowledgement of the Northern Supply contract as additional security, arranged in the same organized way she arranged everything. Carson counted the cash. He went through it twice. He looked at the contract documentation. He looked at his own records. Then he looked at Graham. "This completes the outstanding balance," he said. His voice was careful and flat, and doing a great deal of work to stay that way. "Plus the accrued interest at the rate specified in the original agreement," Margaret said. "You'll find the calculation on the last page." Carson looked at the last page. He didn't argue with the calculation, which told Graham the calculation was right. He stamped the mortgage paid. He signed the release. He slid the documents across the desk and kept his eyes on the paperwork rather than on either of them. And Graham thought about what Margaret had said weeks ago, that Carson wasn't a bad man exactly, just a cautious man who followed the money. He looked at Warren Carson right now and thought that might be true, but that it also wasn't entirely an excuse, and that Carson probably knew it. "The Water Authority complaint," Graham said. "Caldwell's filing." Carson looked up. "We filed a response 4 days ago," Graham said. "With the 1871 survey and Cross's legal opinion, I expect the authority will dismiss it within the week." He paused. "I wanted you to know that." Carson said nothing for a moment. Then, I see. Because whoever told you this property was heading for a forced sale was wrong, Graham said. And I imagine they told you other things too. And I imagine some of those things might also turn out to be wrong. It was as direct as Graham had ever been with Warren Carson in 11 years of doing business at this bank. And Carson received it the way a man receives something he's been expecting. Not with surprise, with the particular stillness of someone who has already had the conversation with himself. The ranch is in good standing, Carson said, as of today. As of today, Graham agreed. They walked out of the bank into the January cold, and Graham stood on the boardwalk and felt the absence of the weight he'd been carrying since August. Not a dramatic sensation, not what he'd imagined it would feel like. It felt more like the moment after you've set down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot your shoulders could sit at a different angle. Margaret stood beside him, her notebook already out, writing something. "What are you writing?" he asked. "The order for the remaining iron stock for the Holt brackets," she said. "We're in Helena. I want to stop at the supplier on the way out." He almost laughed. He didn't quite, but it was close. "The mortgage is paid," he said. "I know." She kept writing. "And in 8 days, the remaining 6 brackets are due to Holt. Things that are finished don't stop the things that come next." She glanced up at him briefly. "That's not a criticism, it's just how it works." "I know how it works," he said. "Good." She closed the notebook. "Then let's get the iron stock." They stopped at the supplier. They had coffee at a place on the main street that had been there since before Graham could remember, and Margaret ate a piece of pie that she reported was adequate, which in her vocabulary meant good. On the way out of the city, she asked Graham about the spring cattle plan, when he intended to start building the herd back up, what his target number was, whether he'd thought about the pasture rotation given the current fence line condition. He'd thought about it. He had thoughts. They talked about cattle for 40 minutes, which was a conversation Graham had not had with anyone in several years, and he found that his thoughts were more coherent than he'd expected, as if the last 3 weeks had reorganized something in his thinking that had been muddled for a long time. On the 14th of February, the Water Authority dismissed Caldwell's complaint. The dismissal letter cited the 1871 survey and Cross's legal opinion and used language that was formal and measured. And that, translated out of administrative prose, meant this complaint had no merit and should not have been filed. A copy was sent to Caldwell Land Associates. Graham read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Margaret. She read it, set it down, and went back to the piece she was working on, a custom gate panel for a rancher north of Helena who'd found them through Frank Dellard, part of a growing list of clients that the Dellard connection had generated in the 6 weeks since Graham had written that letter back to the DD Ranch. "That's done then," Graham said. "That part of it," she said. "The complaint? Yes." "You think he'll file something else?" "I think Victor Caldwell will keep looking for an angle until he finds one or runs out of angles." She didn't stop working. "But he's running out. He's lost the bank leverage. He's lost the Water Authority complaint. The fence line activity stopped after he came here in January." A pause, a hammer strike, another pause. "He's not defeated. He's recalculating." "How long does recalculation take?" "Depends on what he comes up with." She looked up from the anvil. "But the longer this operation runs, the more connections it has, the harder it becomes to disrupt. Each month is different from the last month." She held the piece up to the light coming through the lean-to's open side. "He counted on you being alone. You weren't alone. That changes the math." It changed the math. Graham sat with that phrase for the rest of the day. He hadn't been alone. That was the thing he kept coming back to, not with sentimentality, not with the particular softness that loneliness produces when it's relieved, but with the honest recognition of what had actually happened. He'd placed an advertisement for a wife because he was desperate and because the desperation had taken on a specific shape in his mind. He needed someone, and the shape of that someone had been formed by years of living alone and thinking about what he was missing. He'd imagined someone who needed what he had. What he got was someone who had what he needed. There was a difference, and it was not a small one. Holt's trial order was delivered on March 13th, 2 days ahead of schedule. All 12 brackets to specification, with the kind of finish that Margaret produced consistently, not showpiece quality, not rough, exactly as functional as they needed to be, and not concerned with being anything else. Holt came himself to receive delivery, which Graham had not expected. He inspected each bracket with the same applied physical force he'd used on the test piece in January. He went through all 12. He set the last one down on the tailgate of his wagon and looked at Margaret. "Standing order," he said, 24 per quarter, starting June 1st. Margaret nodded. "I also want to talk to you about something else," Holt said. He looked at Graham and back at Margaret, making it clear he was including both of them. "I run supply to 6 teams. 3 of those teams have been having problems with their wheel hardware, sourcing issues, quality variations. I need a reliable supplier who can handle custom work on short notice when something breaks on the road." He paused. "You're 40 miles closer to the main route than my Billings contact, and you're better." "Define better," Margaret said. "Consistent dimensions, right hardness for the application, no order delays." He said it flatly, as if it were a description of minimum requirements, not a compliment. "What I mean by better is reliable." "We can handle road emergency repairs," Margaret said. "Turnaround time depends on the complexity and the stock we have on hand. For standard wheel and axle hardware, 48 hours from order to completion." "That works." Holt reached into his coat for his paperwork. Graham watched the two of them settle the terms and thought about 48 hours and road emergency repairs and the supply routes running north and south through Montana and what it meant for a forge operation to be connected to those routes in the way Holt was describing. It meant Victor Caldwell's window was closing. Not because Victor had been defeated in any dramatic sense. Not because there had been a confrontation or a legal victory or a moment of public humiliation. It was closing the way most things close in real life. Gradually, through accumulation, through the slow building of a situation that became increasingly difficult to disrupt because too many people depended on it running. Frank Dellard's gate was completed on March 20th and delivered by Graham and 2 ranch hands Dellard had sent to help with the loading because the gate was substantial and required more people than 2 to move safely. Dellard came out of his house to look at it before they'd finished unloading, and he walked around it with his hands behind his back in the posture of a man conducting a serious evaluation. It was his father's design. Margaret had worked from the pencil sketch, following the old dimensions and adding the refinements that came from actually knowing how iron behaved at those scales. The Holloway brand in the center, the 2 overlapping H's, was clean and well proportioned, and the scrollwork along the top bar had a quality that Graham couldn't describe precisely, except to say that it looked inevitable, like it had always been meant to be that shape. Dellard looked at the brand in the center for a long time. "Your father drew this?" he asked. "Yes," Graham said. Dellard nodded slowly. "I knew your father. Not well, but well enough. He was a man who built things to last." He looked at the gate. "This'll outlast both of us." He paid the remaining balance on the spot and shook Graham's hand and then, more deliberately, Margaret's hand. "I've been sending people your way," Dellard said to her. "I'll keep doing it." "I appreciate it," Margaret said. "Don't appreciate it." He let go of her hand. "It's just good sense. Territory needs a good smith. Doesn't much matter to me who that is, as long as the work's right." He looked at her with the same level of valuation he'd used at the market in December. "Your work is right." On the drive home, with the empty delivery rigging rattling in the wagon bed, Graham looked at the road ahead and said, "My father would have liked her." He didn't mean to say it. It came out from somewhere underneath the day's practical events, from a part of him that had been processing something slowly and quietly and had apparently finished. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "What was he like?" she asked. Graham thought about it. "Stubborn," he said. "Patient. Better at starting things than finishing them, except when it came to the land. He was relentless about the land." He watched the road. He used to say the ranch was an argument he was making, that every fence post and every water line was a sentence in the argument, and you didn't get to stop mid-sentence just because it was hard. "An argument for what?" "For staying," Graham said. "For not moving on when things got difficult. For the idea that a place could be worth what you put into it." Margaret considered this. "Thomas used the forge the same way," she said. "He'd say every piece was a conversation. That when you hand someone something you made, you're telling them something about what you thought was worth doing." A pause. "I always thought that was a little fanciful. But I understand it better now." She glanced at him sideways. "The gate, the brackets, even the windmill collar, they say something about what this place is and what it's trying to be." "Not trying," Graham said. "Being." She looked at him. It's not trying to be something anymore, he said. It is something. He wasn't sure when that had changed, sometime between Christmas morning and now, through the accumulation of work days and defended ground. That's different. They pulled into the ranch yard as the afternoon light went long and gold across the frozen ground, and Bolt came out of the barn at a run, barking with the whole body enthusiasm she brought to every return, and Rivet appeared in the forge doorway and stood with her head tilted like she was cataloging the change in routine. Graham unhitched the horses. Margaret went to the forge to bank the fire for the night, and he heard the familiar sounds, the bellows breathing down, the clink of tools being returned to their places on the wall. In late March, Victor Caldwell sold the Mackenzie property, not to another rancher, to a land development trust out of Chicago that had been buying Montana land for eventual sale to Eastern investors, which was a different business from water rights consolidation, and told Graham that Victor was redirecting his capital somewhere else, a different strategy, a different territory. The news came through Dellard, who had it from the county recorder's office, and Graham told Margaret over dinner. She listened. He found another angle, she said, just not here. Should I feel? Graham started. Relieved, she said. Probably. He's not gone. Men like that don't go away. But he's moved to where the easier returns are. She poured more coffee. Which means we weren't worth the difficulty anymore. We made it not worth it. Yes. She turned the mug in her hands. We made it not worth it. There was a quality to that sentence, understated, precise, carrying more weight than the words themselves, that Graham sat with for a moment. Outside, the March wind was beginning to have a different character than January's wind. Still cold, but thinner, with a suggestion of something else moving behind it. The kind of wind that meant something was coming. Not yet, not for weeks, but coming. Spring. The first real possibility of it. He'd lived through 60-some springs in Montana, and he still felt the turn of them somewhere in his chest. That ancient, stubborn, biological conviction that the hard part was not permanent. I want to talk to you about something, he said. Margaret looked at him across the table. He'd been finding the words for this for a while. Not for weeks, not since the beginning, the way that some kinds of feelings arrive fully formed and just need time to become speakable. More recently. In the last several weeks, noticing it was there and not knowing what to do with it, because Graham Holloway had spent 6 years not knowing what to do with things like this, and had gotten very practiced at leaving them alone. I put an advertisement in a paper, he said. I was looking for a wife. I know, Margaret said. I answered it. I wasn't looking for what I found. He said it carefully, because imprecision felt dishonest, and he'd done enough of that early on. I thought I had a picture in my mind of what I needed. It was wrong, and I think... He paused. I think if you'd been what I was picturing, you couldn't have saved this ranch. You saved it because you were what you actually are, not what I was looking for. Margaret was quiet. I'm not saying that well, he said. You're saying it fine, she said. Keep going. I'd like... He stopped. Tried again. I asked you here to be a wife. I haven't said anything about that in 3 months because it seemed wrong to say anything about it while there was so much else. He looked at the table. That wasn't entirely honest either. The truth is I didn't know what I felt for a long time, and then I did know, and I didn't know how to say it without making it sound like I was only grateful. Are you only grateful? Margaret asked. He looked up at her. No, he said. She looked at him with the level, patient attention she brought to problems she was working out. Not coldly, not without feeling, but with the honesty that was her primary mode. I'm not the woman from the advertisement, she said. I'm not... She paused. I'm not easy to live with, Graham. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm usually right, and I know I'm usually right, which is its own problem. I go to the forge before dawn, and I don't stop when I should, and I'm not... She searched for the word. I'm not soft, in the way some people mean that. I know, he said. Thomas loved me, and he found me difficult, she said. I loved him, and I found him difficult. That doesn't go away because people are well matched. I know that too. She turned the mug again, a full, slow rotation. What I feel, she said carefully, is that this is the first place in 4 years where what I know how to do is exactly what's needed, and that matters to me more than I thought it would. She looked at him. And that you're not easy either. You carry things alone until you can't anymore, and then you ask for help in the way that people ask for help who've never done it, badly and too late. A pause. But you listen. When someone tells you something, you actually change based on it. That's rarer than it should be. Graham was quiet. I'm not saying no, Margaret said. I'm saying I want you to know what you're asking. All of it, not a picture. I know what I'm asking, he said. I've been watching you work for 3 months. That's a strange courtship. It's the only kind I know how to do anymore, he said. Watch how someone works and see who they are. The wind moved outside. The fire in the stove adjusted itself with a small sound. All right, Margaret said. They were married in April, on a Wednesday, because Wednesday was the day they could get to Mill Haven without disrupting the production schedule. The ceremony was at the county clerk's office, practical, brief, witnessed by the clerk, and a woman from the adjacent land office who happened to be in the hallway and was recruited for the purpose. Margaret wore her good coat. Graham wore the jacket he'd worn to the bank in January. There was no party afterward. They drove back to the ranch and Graham made dinner and Margaret checked on the windmill bracket, which still did not need adjustment, and Rivet followed her back to the house and Bolt got into the grain bin and had to be extracted. In the evening they sat at the kitchen table, which was where most things happened now, and Margaret was writing in her notebook. Client orders, production schedule. And Graham was reading through the spring cattle plan he'd been developing and occasionally asking her a question. She answered without looking up, and the fire in the stove was doing what fires did. It was not a remarkable evening. It was an ordinary evening, the kind built from the inside rather than the outside, from the particular texture of two people occupying the same space with the same seriousness about the same work. Graham looked up from his papers and looked at the woman across the table who had arrived on the last train before Christmas, with a leather suitcase and a canvas roll of tools and a calm that he'd mistaken for reserve and had turned out to be something different, not reserve but foundation, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing what you can do and not needing anyone's permission to do it. He'd spent a year looking for someone to bring warmth back to his house. What he'd found was a woman who brought fire. Not the comfortable kind. The working kind. The kind that changes the shape of things. He thought about his father's sketch on the workbench, and the gate it had become, and the way Margaret had held that sketch in the forge light and said, "Your father had skill." He thought about the cedar trunk full of documents that had been sitting in the closet for 6 years while the ranch died slowly around them, everything he needed within reach the whole time. He thought about the foreclosure notice that had hung on the bunkhouse wall and was now ash in the forge, burned on Christmas morning. I thought about what it meant to find what you need in the form you weren't expecting it. The frontier teaches you things if you survive it long enough. It teaches you that plans rarely match the ground, that the drought comes when you didn't plan for drought, and the person who saves your ranch isn't the person you pictured when you were desperate enough to ask for help, that what you think you need and what you actually need are often completely different things, and the gap between those two things is where most of the important events in a life occur. He'd asked for a wife to make the house feel less empty. He'd gotten something harder to describe and more difficult to live with, and more valuable than anything he'd known how to ask for. The ranch was still hard. The frontier didn't stop being what it was because one man's situation had improved. The winter would come back, and the cattle would have their difficulties, and there would be equipment failures and bad seasons and clients who paid late and orders that needed renegotiating. Victor Caldwell was still out there, building a different version of the same plan somewhere else, and that was the kind of problem the world generated in unlimited supply. But the mortgage was paid, the forge was running, the windmill was turning, and the gate at the entrance to the Holloway Ranch, his father's design, built at last in iron that would outlast both of them, stood at the road where anyone coming or going could read what it said. Not in words. In the weight of the metal, in the care of the joins, in the mark at the center. This place is worth what was put into it. This place is defended. This place is home. Margaret turned a page in her notebook and wrote something Graham couldn't read from his angle, and the fire talked to the wind outside, and Rivet moved in her sleep on the floor by the stove, and Graham Holloway, 62 years old, widower, third-generation rancher, man who had learned too late and just in time that asking for help was not the same as losing, picked up his pen and went back to work.